Welcome to a journey to a time when an entire continent was forever changed by conquest, greed, religion, and resistance. When the Spaniards came to South America in the 16th century, they did not encounter an empty land, but powerful empires, ancient cultures, and millions of people with their own languages, gods, and traditions. But what followed was a history full of violence, gold prospecting, forced labor, missionary work, but also cultural mixing and uprisings against colonial rule. In this video, we explore the question: how did Spain manage to conquer large parts of South America and control them for centuries? And now it's up to you. What do you think was the most important reason for the Spanish conquest of South America? Gold, religion, power, or something else entirely? Write your answer in the comments below. If you're interested in history and want to learn more about the world's major turning points, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss any more videos about colonial empires, revolutions, and the events that shape our world to this day. And with that, we begin with the history of the Spanish colonies in South America. Chapter 1. Prologue: A Continent Before Conquest. Before the first Spanish ships appeared on the coasts of South America, the continent was by no means an unknown, empty, or undeveloped space. South America was a huge habitat full of cultures, languages, cities, trade routes, and religious ideas. From the high peaks of the Andes to the dense rainforests of the Amazon to the arid coastal regions of the Pacific, millions of people lived in societies that had developed over centuries. They built cities, planted fields, worshipped their gods, waged wars, formed alliances, and traded over long distances. For the people who lived there, South America was not the New World. It was her world. It was the land of their ancestors, their myths, and their future. The diversity of this continent was enormous. The Andes are where some of the most impressive cultures in the Americas emerged. Long before the arrival of the Spaniards, societies such as the Chavan, Moche, Nazca, Tiwanaku, and Wari had left important traces. They built temples, developed irrigation systems, made elaborate ceramics and textiles, and created religious centers that attracted people from far away. Their achievements formed the basis for later empires, including the mighty Inca Empire, which ruled large parts of western South America in the 15th and early 16th centuries. But the Inca Empire was not the only significant power. In today's Colombia lived the Muisca, who became famous for their gold processing and later played an important role in the Spanish legends about the legendary El Dorado. In the rainforests of the Amazon, there were numerous communities with their own political structures, trade relations, and spiritual ideas. On the coasts, in the plains, and in the south of the continent lived other groups that had adapted to very different environmental conditions. These people did not live in isolation from each other. Even though there were no horses, iron weapons, or wheels in the European sense, paths, rivers, and trade networks connected many regions with each other. Goods, ideas, and religious ideas could be passed on over great distances. Shells from coastal regions, feathers from the rainforest, salt, textiles, ceramics, metals, and foodstuffs were transported from one region to another through barter. Especially in the Andes, transport and organization were impressive. Llamas served as beasts of burden, and a network of paths made it possible to move messages, goods, and people over mountains, valleys, and plateaus. Nature posed enormous challenges for the people of South America. The Andes were steep, cold, and difficult to access. The Amazon was wet, densely overgrown, and full of rivers. The Pacific coast was dry and desert-like in many regions. But it was precisely these difficult conditions that led to remarkable adjustments. In the Andes, people developed terraced fields in order to be able to practice agriculture even on steep mountain slopes. They grew potatoes, corn, quinoa, and other crops adapted to different altitudes. In coastal regions, irrigation systems were created to divert water from rivers to fields. In the Amazon, many communities used the rivers as transport routes and lived from fishing, hunting, gathering, and agriculture. Religion played a central role in many societies. People did not see themselves as separate from nature, but as part of a living cosmos. Mountains, rivers, sun, moon, animals, and ancestors could have spiritual significance. In the Andes, certain mountains were considered sacred beings. The sun was worshipped, as well as fertility, earth, and water. Rituals were supposed to ensure the balance between humans, nature, and gods. Offerings, festivals, and ceremonies accompanied the course of the year, the harvest, political decisions, and important transitions in life. These religious ideas were closely linked to power. Rulers often based their authority not only on military strength, but also on their relationship to the gods or ancestors. Whoever ruled had to create order, distribute food, perform rituals, and ensure the well-being of the community. In great empires such as that of the Incas, religion was an important means of keeping different peoples together. The Incas especially worshipped the sun god Inti and portrayed their rulers as descendants of the sun. As a result, political rule became a sacred order. Social organization was also highly developed. Many communities were based on family associations, village communities, or larger regional alliances. In the Andes, the principle of mutual work played a major role. People helped each other build houses, harvest, or work on public projects. Work was not only an economic necessity, but also part of a social obligation. This system was later greatly expanded by the Incas and used for large construction projects, agriculture, and military purposes. However, the societies of South America were not peaceful paradises. There were conflicts, wars, conquests, and power struggles. Empires grew by subjugating other groups or forcing them into alliances. The Inca Empire also spread through war, diplomacy, and skillful administration. Defeated groups had to pay taxes, perform labor services, or show their loyalty to the Inca ruler. Some accepted the new order, others resisted. When the Spanish arrived later, South America was therefore not a unified continent, but a space full of tensions, alliances, and rivalries. It was precisely these internal conflicts that were to play an important role for the European conquerors. The Spaniards were initially few in number. They could not defeat great empires by their own strength alone. They exploited existing enmities, formed alliances with opponents of the ruling powers, and profited from political crises. Especially in the Inca Empire, the situation was tense shortly before the Spanish arrival. A civil war over the succession had weakened the empire. This weakness was later ruthlessly exploited by the conquerors. But even before violence, disease, and colonial rule shook the continent, a world with its own history existed. This story did not begin with Europe. It began thousands of years earlier, with humans domesticating plants, building cities, creating trade routes, and shaping their environment in impressive ways. The Spanish conquest was therefore not a beginning, but a rupture. She encountered societies that were already complex, creative, and deeply rooted. So when we talk about the Spanish colonies in South America, we must not start with the conquerors. We must first look at the people who lived there before the sails appeared on the horizon. This is the only way to understand what was really lost with colonization, what was changed, and what survived despite everything. The languages, traditions, food, forms of music, and religious ideas of many South American countries still bear traces of this pre-colonial world today. Despite oppression and violence, indigenous cultures did not disappear. They adapted, resisted, and preserved parts of their identity. The history of South America is therefore not only the history of the Spanish conquest. It is also the story of the people who were there long before and whose descendants are still fighting for recognition, land, and memory. So at the beginning of this story, there is a continent full of life. A continent with powerful empires and small communities, with sacred mountains and dense forests, with trade routes, rituals, and political conflicts. A continent that understood itself long before Europe discovered it. And it was precisely into this world that men penetrated in the 16th century who searched for gold, wanted to convert souls, and made claims to ownership in the name of a foreign king. For the Spaniards, South America was an opportunity for wealth and fame. For the people of the continent, a time of uncertainty, violence, and resistance began. But to understand how this conquest became possible, we must first turn to the most powerful empire in South America, the Inca Empire, the center of power in the Andes. Chapter 2: The Inca Empire, Power Center of the Andes. When talking about South America before the Spanish conquest, there is no way around the Inca Empire. It was the largest empire ever to exist on the American continent, and at the time of its greatest expansion, it stretched for several thousand kilometers along the Andes. His influence ranged from areas in today's Colombia to Ecuador, Peru and Bolivia to Chile and Argentina. The Incas called their empire Tawantinsuyu, which means land of the four parts. This name already shows how the Incas understood their world, as an ordered whole, divided into four large regions and ruled from a sacred center. This center was Cusco, a city in the highlands of present-day Peru. For the Incas, Cusco was not just a capital. It was considered the center of the world, the political, religious, and symbolic heart of the empire. From here, the Sapa Inca, the supreme ruler, ruled. He was not only a king in the secular sense, but was also regarded as the son of the sun. His power was therefore based not only on administration and the military, but also on religion. Those who obeyed the Sapa Inca obeyed not only a ruler, but an order that was understood as divine. The Incas themselves were originally only one group among many in the Andean region. Their rise began comparatively late, probably in the 13th century. For a long time, they mainly controlled the region around Cusco. It was not until the 15th century that their empire developed into an imperial power. Especially under rulers like Pachacutec and his successors, the Inca Empire expanded at an impressive speed. Through conquests, alliances, resettlements, and skillful administration, numerous peoples were incorporated into the empire. The Incas did not always proceed in the same way. Sometimes they rely on military force. Their armies were well organized and could cover great distances. In other cases, they offered advantages to local rulers: protection, access to supplies, prestige, or the possibility of maintaining their position under Inca supremacy. Those who submitted voluntarily could often count on milder treatment. Those who resisted had to reckon with destruction, forced resettlement, or harsh control. The special thing about the Inca Empire was not only its size, but above all its organization. The Andes are a difficult habitat. High mountains, deep valleys, extreme differences in altitude and different climate zones made rule and supply complicated. But the Incas developed a system that turned these challenges into strength. They took advantage of the diversity of the landscape by connecting different altitude zones. At lower altitudes, corn, fruits, and cotton grew. In higher regions, potatoes, quinoa, and other resistant crops were grown. On the plateaus, people kept llamas and alpacas, which supplied meat, wool, and transport. To connect these different regions, the Incas built a vast network of roads. It led over mountains, through valleys, along gorges, and over plateaus. Bridges made of plant fibers spanned rivers and abysses. Stairs, dams, and paths also made hard-to-reach areas accessible. This network was not used for private travel, but above all for the state. Soldiers, civil servants, workers, and messengers used the paths. Particularly important were the so-called chasca, fast runners who passed on messages over long distances. They ran from station to station and were able to transport information through the empire at an astonishing speed. Although the Incas did not use a writing system like the Europeans, they had a sophisticated means of storing information, the quipus. These were knotted cords that were used to record numbers and possibly other information. Civil servants used them to record taxes, inventories, population figures, or work performance. For an empire without alphabetic script, this was a remarkable administrative achievement. It shows that complex organization was not necessarily tied to writing in the European sense. A central component of the Incan order was the obligation to work. Money did not play a role in the Inca Empire as it did in Europe. Instead of paying taxes in coins, people did work for the state. This system was called mita. Village communities provided workers for agriculture, road construction, military service, mining, or the construction of temples and administrative centers. In return, the state organized supplies, shelter, and religious festivals. Food, clothing, tools, and weapons were stored in large warehouses. These supplies could be distributed in times of famine, war, or natural disasters. Society was strongly hierarchical. At the top was the Sapa Inca, surrounded by his family, high nobles, priests, and officials. Among them were local elites, who were often integrated into the empire as long as they remained loyal. The vast majority of the population lived in village communities, the so-called ailas. These communities were linked by kinship, land use, and mutual obligations. Land did not belong to individuals in the modern sense, but was used collectively and distributed according to certain rules. Religion deeply shaped the life of the Incas. The sun god Inti occupied a prominent position, but other deities and sacred places were also important. The huacas were particularly important. These could be sacred stones, springs, mountains, temples, or special landscapes. The Incas saw the world as permeated by spiritual forces. Rituals, offerings, and festivals were intended to maintain the balance between people, nature, and gods. The ancestors also played an important role. The mummies of deceased rulers were venerated, cared for, and symbolically continued to be included in political decisions. This combination of religion and politics strengthened the power of the state. If the Sapa Inca was considered the son of the sun, then resistance to him also became an attack on the divine order. At the same time, the Incas often adopted local cults into their empire. They did not always destroy the religions of subjugated peoples, but tried to integrate them into their own order. This allowed them to exert control without completely extinguishing any local tradition. But behind the impressive facade of the Inca Empire, there were tensions. Many peoples had only been subjugated shortly before the arrival of the Spaniards. Not everyone really felt connected to the Sapa Inca. Some groups hated forced labor, resettlement, or control by foreign officials. Others were waiting for an opportunity to regain their independence. These internal tensions later became a decisive weak point of the empire. In addition, there was a serious political crisis shortly before the Spanish conquest. After the death of the ruler Huayna Capac, there was a power struggle between his sons Huáscar and Atahualpa. This conflict developed into a civil war that shook the empire. Armies fought against each other, elites were divided, and entire regions had to choose sides. In the end, Atahualpa prevailed, but the victory came at a dangerous time. The empire was weakened, many people were exhausted, and the political order was unstable. It was precisely in this phase that the Spaniards appeared. For them, the Inca Empire was a tremendous treasure, a huge, organized, and rich empire, but one that had become vulnerable to internal conflicts. The Spaniards quickly realized that they did not only have to fight with weapons. They could exploit rivalries, form alliances with disaffected groups, and use the capture of a ruler as a political tool. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to look at the Inca Empire only through its later demise. It was one of the great civilizations in world history. Its streets, terraced fields, administrative structures, and cities bear witness to an extraordinary ability to connect people and landscapes. Places like Cusco or Machu Picchu still stand for the technical and cultural achievement of the Incas. Many agricultural traditions, languages, and worldviews of the Andean region have also survived the colonial period. The Inca Empire was therefore much more than a victim of the Spanish conquest. It was a powerful state with its own order, a deep religious imagination, and an impressive administration. This is precisely why its conquest was so important for the Spaniards. Those who controlled the Inca Empire controlled not only people and land, but also roads, warehouses, labor, and access to the riches of the Andes. But before the Spaniards could destroy this empire, they first had to find their way there. Their journey began not in the Andes, but on the other side of the Atlantic, in a Spain that was undergoing profound changes of its own and whose rulers were striving for power, gold, and religious glory. Chapter 3: Spain looks west. At the end of the 15th century, Spain was a country in transition. 4 centuries, the Iberian Peninsula had been shaped by various Christian and Muslim rulers. Kingdoms emerged, disappeared, fought against each other, and formed alliances. But towards the end of the Middle Ages, the order of power changed decisively. With the marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, 2 of the most important Christian empires in Spain were dynastically linked. This union did not yet create a modern nation-state, but it laid the foundation for a new political strength. In 1492, Granada, the last Muslim dominion on the Iberian Peninsula, fell. For the Spanish kings, this victory was more than a military success. It was celebrated as a religious triumph. After centuries of the so-called Reconquista, Isabella and Ferdinand saw themselves as defenders of the Catholic faith. This idea also shaped Spain's view of the world outside Europe. Conquest, rule, and mission were closely linked. Those who won new territories were not only to secure land and wealth, but also to spread the Christian faith. It was precisely at this moment that Christopher Columbus entered the Spanish court. He promised to find a western sea route to Asia. Spices, silk, gold, and other luxury goods from the East were highly sought after in Europe. Until now, many trade routes have run through intermediaries and through areas controlled by other powers. Portugal was therefore already looking for a way around Africa to India. Spain did not want to lag behind in this development. Columbus offered a way to overtake Portugal and find its own gateway to the riches of Asia. When Columbus sailed across the Atlantic in 1492, he believed he was on his way to India. Instead, he reached islands in the Caribbean. For Europe, this marked the beginning of a new phase of expansion. For the people of America, a time of profound upheaval began. At first, the Spaniards themselves hardly understood the dimension of this discovery. For a long time, they believed that they had reached the outskirts of Asia. But it soon became clear that on the other side of the Atlantic lay vast countries, unknown societies, and unimagined riches. Spain's gaze was now increasingly directed to the west. It was not only about a thirst for adventure. Several forces worked together: economic interests, religious zeal, political ambition, and personal hopes of individual men. Spain wanted to play a leading role in the competition between the European powers. Portugal had already established trading bases in Africa and later in Asia. Other powers such as France and England would also look overseas. Whoever acted first could secure land, trade routes, and riches. For the Spanish crown, the new territories were a huge opportunity. It promised revenue, power, and prestige. But Spain did not have unlimited money and people to finance all expeditions itself. Therefore, a system emerged in which private conquerors, so-called conquistadors, played an important role. Men like Hernán Cortés or Francisco Pizarro did not act completely independently, but they bore great personal risks. They organized expeditions, gathered men, procured weapons, and hoped for booty, land, titles, and fame. If successful, the crown also benefited, as conquered territories were claimed in the name of the Spanish king. For many of these men, the journey to the West was an opportunity for social advancement. In Spain, ownership, title, and influence were often tied to origin. Not every younger son of a noble family could expect a large inheritance. Not every soldier found a secure future after the wars on the Iberian Peninsula. The New World promised opportunities that Europe did not offer many people. There, a man who was insignificant in Spain could suddenly become a governor, a large landowner, or a rich mine owner. The stories of gold, precious stones, and powerful empires further fueled these hopes. Gold played a central role from the beginning. The Spaniards were already looking for precious metals in the Caribbean. They forced indigenous people to work, demanded tributes, and combed rivers and landscapes for gold. The amount was limited at first, but the idea of immeasurable riches remained. Again and again, the Spaniards heard rumors about rich countries in the west and south. Such stories were retold, exaggerated and embellished with fantasy. Reports of golden jewelry, rich rulers, and ceremonial objects gave rise to dreams of cities made of gold. But wealth alone does not fully explain Spanish expansion. Religion was just as important. The Spanish rulers received far-reaching rights from the Pope to proselytize the new territories. This was a religious justification for the conquest. From the Spanish point of view, the indigenous populations were to be converted to Christianity. In practice, this often meant coercion, violence, and the destruction of religious traditions. Churches were built on ancient sanctuaries, missionaries learned indigenous languages, preached the Christian faith, and fought rituals they saw as pagan. There were also discussions within Spain and the Church. Some clerics condemned the brutal treatment of the indigenous population. Especially later, voices were raised asking whether Spain had the right to subjugate entire peoples. But in the early phase of the conquest, the conviction that the spread of Christianity and the power of the crown belonged together usually prevailed. For many conquistadors, religion was also a useful argument to morally justify conquest. Another decisive factor was the European worldview of the time. Many Spaniards viewed non-Christian societies as inferior or as people who needed to be led and converted. This attitude made it easier to portray violence as necessary or even just. If indigenous rulers did not submit voluntarily, the Spaniards could interpret this as resistance against God and king. Thus, power politics became a supposedly sacred task. Spanish expansion to the west was also made possible by new technologies and experience. Shipbuilding had improved, navigation skills increased, and the Atlantic crossing became easier to plan after the first voyages. The Spaniards used weapons made of steel, crossbows, later firearms, and above all horses, which were unknown in America before the arrival of the Europeans. But technology alone did not decide everything. At least as important were political strategy, alliances with indigenous opponents of great empires, and the devastating effect of imported diseases. After the first decades in the Caribbean, attention was increasingly focused on the mainland. The conquest of the Aztec Empire by Hernán Cortés in Mexico showed that small Spanish groups with local allies could bring down a powerful empire. This news spread and changed expectations. If there had been a rich empire in the north, why shouldn't there be more in the south? The idea of a second great treasure empire drove men like Francisco Pizarro. Pizarro and others heard reports of a powerful empire in the Andes. The information was fragmentary at first, but it was enough to arouse desire. It was said that there was a rich ruler, artistic cities, gold, silver, and a well-organized population. For the Spaniards, this sounded like a new opportunity to gain fame and fortune. For the people of the Inca Empire, it meant that a foreign power was getting closer and closer. The West thus became a space of projections for Spain. They did not see people with their own history at first, but opportunities: land, gold, labor, souls to be converted, and empires to claim in the name of the king. This mixture of greed, faith, and striving for power made the Spanish expansion so dynamic and so destructive. It should not be forgotten that the conquest was not fully planned from the beginning. It developed step by step. An island led to the next coast, a rumor to the next expedition, a success to even greater expectations. Trade voyages turned into conquests. Bases became colonies. Encounters turned into submissions. And the search for a way to Asia gave rise to an empire that would control large parts of America. As Spain looked west, it saw a future full of wealth and divine destiny. But this view was blind to the consequences it would have for the people of South America. For the Spanish crown, expansion meant power. For the conquistadors, it meant promotion. For the church, it meant mission. For the indigenous societies, however, it meant the beginning of an epoch in which their world was shaken by foreign claims, foreign weapons, and foreign diseases. The way to South America was thus prepared. Spain had the political goals, the religious justification, the military experience, and the men willing to risk everything. What was still missing was direct contact with those societies that were soon to become the target of the conquest. And it was precisely these first encounters between Spaniards and indigenous peoples that were full of misunderstandings, curiosity, fear, and violence. They decided whether foreign visitors became trading partners, allies, or enemies. This is the beginning of the next chapter, the First Contacts. Chapter 4, The First Contacts. When the Spaniards first encountered the coasts and islands of America, it was not simply two strange groups of people who met. Two worlds collided that hardly knew anything about each other and found it difficult to understand each other. For the Spaniards, the people of America were part of a mysterious new reality, which they tried to explain in terms of Europe. For the indigenous societies, on the other hand, the newcomers appeared as foreign men with unknown weapons, strange clothing, large ships, and animals that had not been known in America until then. These first contacts were characterized by curiosity, uncertainty, hope, and mistrust. In some moments, there was an exchange and understanding. At other moments, the encounter quickly turned violent. The Spaniards brought gifts, asked for gold, erected crosses, and claimed land in the name of their king. The indigenous groups observed, negotiated, withdrew, or sought their own advantages in the encounter. Neither side could fully comprehend the consequences of these contacts at the beginning. For the Spaniards, gold was almost always one of the first questions. Already in the Caribbean, they had learned to pay attention to jewelry, trade goods, and references to precious metals. When they met people wearing golden objects, they immediately interpreted this as a sign of hidden riches. Gold and other valuable materials had a different meaning in many indigenous societies than in Europe. They were not simply money or possessions in the European sense. Gold could have religious, political, or ceremonial significance. It adorned rulers, priests, or sacred objects, and was part of rituals and signs of power. The Spaniards, however, saw above all its material value. This misunderstanding was decisive. What was a symbol for some became prey for others. When indigenous groups handed over gold as a gift, they saw it as a sign of hospitality, diplomacy, or cautious appeasement. For the Spaniards, it was often proof that there had to be more. A gift aroused not gratitude, but greed. Thus, an initial exchange quickly developed into pressure, demand, and violence. Language was also a major barrier. The Spanish did not understand the indigenous languages, and the indigenous people did not understand Spanish or the religious and political formulas with which the Europeans explained their claims. Interpreters were often needed, who themselves had to laboriously mediate between different languages and world views. A misunderstood word could make the difference between peace and war. In addition, many terms had no direct correspondence at all. What did a king who lived on the other side of the ocean mean? What did a pope mean? What did it mean to claim land in the name of a foreign ruler? This problem was particularly evident in the way the Spaniards justified their rule. They saw themselves as representatives of the Spanish crown and Christianity. In their eyes, they had the right to claim new territories for their king and to lead the people living there to the Christian faith. Indigenous rulers should recognize the sovereignty of Spain. But for many indigenous societies, such demands must have seemed absurd. Why should they obey a man they had never seen? Why should their own religion suddenly be wrong? Why should foreigners be allowed to rule over land that has been inhabited by their ancestors for generations? The Spaniards often interpreted rejection as disobedience or enmity. Indigenous groups, on the other hand, had to assess the Spaniards first. Were they traitors, guests, enemies, gods, messengers of other powers? The answers were not the same everywhere. Some groups saw them as possible allies against local opponents. Others quickly recognized the danger and tried to avoid contact or resist. Still others chose a wait-and-see attitude because they could not immediately assess how strong these strangers really were. The effect of European weapons reinforced the impression of the unknown. Steel blades, armor, crossbows, and firearms were very different from the weapons of many indigenous societies. But the firearms of the early conquistadors were still slow, inaccurate, and often unreliable in humid climates. Much more important was often the psychological effect. Noise, smoke, and the destructive power of a shot could frighten people who had never experienced anything like it before. The horses were even more impressive. There were no horses in America before the arrival of the Europeans. A mounted soldier appeared swift, tall, and menacing. In fights, horses could cause panic and give the Spaniards mobility. Nevertheless, the Spaniards were not invincible. They were often in the minority, knew the terrain poorly, and were dependent on food, guides, and information. Without the support of indigenous allies, many expeditions would hardly have survived. The first contacts were therefore not just a one-sided story of Spanish superiority. They were a complex struggle for information, alliances, and advantages. Indigenous groups did not act passively. They observed the Spaniards, used them for their own goals, led them into certain regions, deceived them or attacked them. A decisive factor was existing conflicts within South America. Many regions were politically fragmented. Groups were in rivalry with each other. Some had only recently been subjugated by the Inca Empire. Others suffered from taxes or forced labor. When the Spaniards appeared, some of these groups saw an opportunity. They hoped to weaken old enemies or regain their own independence with the help of the foreigners. The Spaniards, on the other hand, quickly learned to exploit such tensions. Their power arose not only from weapons, but from the ability to interfere in existing conflicts. But in addition to weapons, alliances, and misunderstandings, there was an invisible danger that was more devastating than any blade: disease. The Europeans brought pathogens with them to which the people of America had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, flu, and other diseases often spread faster than the conquerors themselves. Entire communities were weakened before they even had direct contact with Spaniards. Rulers died, families broke up, there was a shortage of workers, religious declarations began to falter. For many indigenous people, these epidemics must have seemed like a catastrophe of cosmic proportions. At first, the Spaniards themselves did not fully understand the role of illness, but they benefited from it. Societies weakened by epidemics could be conquered or politically destabilized more easily. In the Inca Empire, an epidemic probably contributed to the death of the ruler Huayna Capac, which favored the later succession conflict between Huáscar and Atahualpa. Thus, the invisible biological catastrophe intervened directly in political history. The first contacts were therefore much more than short encounters on beaches or in villages. They were the beginning of a deep shift in the balance of power. Every exchange of gifts, every question about gold, every attempt to translate, and every small act of violence could have greater consequences. The Spaniards did not come as neutral visitors. They came with demands, expectations, and an imperial mindset. But even the indigenous societies did not simply meet them helplessly. They reacted with diplomacy, caution, resistance, and their own strategies. These encounters already showed the pattern of the coming decades. The Spaniards sought wealth, domination, and conversion. They interpreted foreign societies through their own ideas and were prepared to use violence if their demands were not met. The indigenous people tried to place the foreigners in their own political world, to understand their intentions and to react to the danger. Between the two sides lay not only linguistic differences, but completely different ideas of property, religion, power, and law. This is precisely why the first contacts were so explosive. They could start with hospitality and end in looting. They could appear as a diplomatic encounter and yet be part of a strategy of conquest. They were able to awaken hope for alliances and at the same time open the way to submission. For South America, these encounters marked the beginning of a new era. It had not yet been decided how far Spanish power would extend. Many indigenous empires and communities were still in a strong position. But the conditions for the conquest had been created. The Spaniards had learned to ask for gold, forge alliances, exploit rivalries, and justify their claims religiously and politically. The decisive moment came when these strategies met the most powerful empire in the Andes. In the heart of the Inca Empire, contact turned into open conquest. There, Francisco Pizarro and his men met a ruler whose empire was huge, but weakened by civil war and disease. And from this encounter arose one of the most dramatic chapters in colonial history, the fall of the Incas. Chapter 5: Francisco Pizarro and the Fall of the Incas. Als Francisco Pizarro und seine Männer in Richtung de Incareichs aufbrachen, wussen sie noch nicht genau, welch Welt sie betreten würden. Sie hatten gerucht gehört von einer mächtigen Herrschers, von Staden in den Bergen, von Gold, Silber und einem Reich, das grosser und reicher sein sollt als alles, was sie Bischergesehen hatten. Für Pizarro war dies Reis ein Chance, die sein ganzes Leben verändern konnte. War kein grosser Adliger aus Spanien, sondern ein Mann, der seinen Aufstieg in der neuen Welt sucht. Wie viel Conquistadoren trieb in ein Mischung aus Urgias, Abenturlust, religioser Überzeugung und Gier nach Reichtumen. Pizarro had already gained experience in America. He knew the harshness of expeditions, the diseases, the hunger, the danger of enemy attacks, and the insecurity of unknown landscapes. But he also knew the stories of the success of other conquerors. In particular, the conquest of the Aztec Empire by Hernán Cortés had shown that a small group of Spaniards could bring down a large empire with determination, violence, and indigenous allies. Pizarro saw this as a role model. If Cortés could defeat a world empire in the north, why shouldn't he succeed in doing the same in the south? Several expeditions took Pizarro and his companions along the Pacific coast of South America. These journeys were dangerous and often disappointing. The men suffered from hunger, exhaustion, and disease. Some wanted to turn back, others doubted the promises of wealth. But Pizarro stuck to his goal. Finally, he received permission from the Spanish crown to conquer and administer territories in the south in the name of the king. Thus, his private quest for fame officially became a company of the Spanish Empire. When the Spaniards finally advanced into the territory of the Inca Empire, they encountered a political situation that could hardly have been more favorable for their plans. The empire was huge and impressively organized, but it was weakened internally. Shortly before, a civil war between the brothers Huáscar and Atahualpa had shaken the empire. Both claimed dominion. Armies had marched against each other, nobles had taken sides, cities and regions were divided. In the end, Atahualpa had won, but his victory was still fresh. Many opponents were not forgotten, many wounds were not healed. In addition, there was the devastating effect of diseases that had been introduced from Europe and had probably spread in the Andean region even before Pizarro's direct appearance. Epidemics had killed people, destroyed families, and possibly also contributed to the death of the former ruler Huayna Capac. This triggered a succession crisis that favored the civil war. When Pizarro arrived, he was not faced with a completely stable empire, but with an empire that seemed powerful on the outside, but was burdened internally by disease, war, and mistrust. Trotzdem waren die Spanier zahlenmäßig winzig. Pizarro verfügte über ein Kleintrupp, einige Pferd, Stahlwaffen, Rüstungen und Feuerwaffen. Gegen die gewaltigen Menschenmengen, die das Incareich mobilisieren konnte, skien dies Gruppe kaum ein Bedrohung zu sein. Aus Sicht Atahualpas müssen die Fremden zunächst eher wie ein merkwürdig gefahrlich, aber begrenzt Erscheinung wirken. Sie waren auffällig bewaffnet und unberechenbar, aber nicht zahlreich genug, ein Reich zu erobern. Genau diese Unterschätzung wurde zu einem entscheidenden Fehler. In 1532, the encounter took place in Cajamarca that was to change the fate of the Inca Empire. Atahualpa was nearby with a large entourage, having just won the civil war. Pizarro invited him to a meeting. The Spaniards were preparing an ambush. They hid in buildings around the square of Cajamarca, while Atahualpa appeared with numerous companions. Many of his people were not prepared for battle. They came expecting a match, perhaps also in the knowledge that their superiority would be intimidating. Then a Spanish clergyman came before Atahualpa and demanded that he recognize the Christian faith and the supremacy of the Spanish king. This scene shows all the absurdity and brutality of the colonial encounter. A ruler who ruled over a vast empire was suddenly to submit to a distant king and a foreign religion, the meaning of which could hardly be explained to him. When Atahualpa did not accept the demands, the Spaniards used this as a pretext to attack. The ambush began with noise, horses, weapons, and panic. The Spaniards stormed out of their hiding places, fired their weapons, and attacked with steel blades. The horses seemed frightening and chaotic to Atahualpa's unprepared companions. A bloodbath ensued on the square. Thousands were injured or killed, while the Spaniards deliberately tried to capture Atahualpa alive. For Pizarro understood that the ruler himself was the key to power. Whoever controlled the Sapa Inca could control the empire. The capture of Atahualpa was a political shock. In the Inca Empire, the ruler was not only a military leader, but a sacred figure, a center of order. His imprisonment paralyzed decision-making processes and created uncertainty. Atahualpa tried to buy his freedom. He offered the Spaniards a huge ransom, a room full of gold and silver. For the Spaniards, this was the confirmation of all their dreams. Golden objects, jewelry, religious works of art, and valuable metals were collected, melted down, and distributed. What often had religious or symbolic significance for the Incas became prey for the Spaniards. But although the ransom was paid, the Spaniards did not release Atahualpa. They feared that he could restore his power and organize a major counterattack. Moreover, his mere existence as a legitimate ruler was a risk. The Spaniards presented him with a sham trial, accused him of treason, idolatry, and other offenses, and sentenced him to death. In 1533, Atahualpa was executed. With his death, the Inca Empire lost its central ruler in a moment of greatest instability. However, the fall of the Incas was not immediately completed. The empire did not collapse in a single day. Many regions resisted, others tried to reorient themselves. The Spaniards installed rulers who seemed useful to them and marched on to Cusco, the sacred center of the empire. There they were able to fall back on existing differences. Supporters of Huáscar, opponents of Atahualpa, and subjugated peoples saw in the Spaniards partly an opportunity to settle old scores. These alliances were decisive. Without indigenous support, the few Spaniards would hardly have been able to control the Andes. When the Spaniards reached Cusco, they entered the symbolic heart of the Incan world. The city was rich, powerful, and religiously significant. For the Spaniards, it was a treasure house. Temples were plundered, golden decorations removed, holy places desecrated. In particular, the Temple of the Sun, one of the most important religious places of the Incas, became a symbol of the colonial upheaval. What had previously been an expression of a divine order was now dismantled, melted down, or reshaped by Christian buildings. But even after the capture of Cusco, resistance remained. One of the most important leaders was Manco Inca, whom the Spaniards had initially installed as a dependent ruler. When he realized that the foreigners were not just allies or temporary rulers, but wanted to permanently subjugate the empire, he rose up against them. In 1536, he besieged Cusco with his troops and put the Spaniards in great distress. The uprising showed that the Incas had by no means collapsed without resistance. They were still able to mobilize large forces and seriously threaten Spanish rule. In the end, however, the Spaniards were able to maintain their position. Internal divisions, military disadvantages, the effect of horses and steel weapons, and the support of indigenous allies helped them. Manco Inca later withdrew to Vilcabamba, where an independent remnant state of the Incas continued to exist for decades. It was not until 1572 that this last retreat was finally conquered by the Spaniards. So the fall of the Incas was not a short moment, but a long process of ambush, political manipulation, alliances, betrayal, violence, and resistance. The conquest of the Inca Empire was a turning point for Spain. With it, one of the richest and best organized empires in America fell into the hands of the Spaniards. They took over roads, labor, agricultural systems, and administrative structures. Above all, however, access to the riches of the Andes opened up to them. Gold and silver were no longer just sought, but systematically exploited. The conquest turned into colonial rule. For the people of the Andes, Pizarro's victory meant a catastrophe. Their political order was destroyed, their religious centers attacked, their rulers disempowered, and their labor soon put into the service of a foreign empire. But here, too, the indigenous population did not simply disappear. It adapted, resisted, negotiated, preserved traditions, and sought ways to survive in a new and brutal order. Francisco Pizarro became one of the most famous conquistadors in history due to the fall of the Incas. But his success was not only based on courage or military strength. It was based on deception, violence, favorable political circumstances, and the exploitation of internal conflicts. The small Spanish troop could not defeat a large empire alone. It won because the Inca Empire was vulnerable at the wrong moment, and because the Spaniards were prepared to ruthlessly exploit this vulnerability. With the death of Atahualpa and the capture of Cusco, a new phase began. The Spaniards had not only overthrown an empire, but had laid the foundation for a colonial order that was to shape South America for centuries. Now it was no longer just about conquest, but about exploitation. The question was no longer whether gold and silver existed, but how these riches could be brought to Spain in the largest possible quantities. This is the beginning of the next chapter: Gold, Silver, and the Greed for Wealth. Chapter 6: Gold, Silver, and the Greed for Wealth. After the Spaniards had shaken the Inca Empire and brought its most important centers of power under their control, a new phase of colonial history began. The time of the first conquests was not yet over, but the quick grab for loot now developed into a permanent system of exploitation. Gold and silver were the focus of attention. For the Spanish conquerors, these precious metals were visible proof that their dangerous journeys, violence, and deprivation had paid off. For the crown in Europe, they became the basis of imperial power. For the indigenous population of South America, they meant forced labor, expulsion, death, and the loss of sacred objects. The capture of Atahualpa in Cajamarca had already shown the importance of precious metals for the Spaniards. The Inca ruler offered a huge ransom to regain his freedom. Rooms were filled with gold and silver, objects were brought in from temples, palaces, and treasuries. But the Spaniards did not look at these works of art and religious objects with reverence. They saw this above all as material value. Much was melted down, divided, and shipped. What had had symbolic, religious, or political significance in the world of the Incas became a commodity in the eyes of the conquerors. Gold was the metal of first desire for the Spaniards. It was shiny, easy to transport, and of enormous value in Europe. The early conquistadors dreamed of golden cities, golden temples, and rulers who lived in immeasurable wealth. These ideas were fueled by rumors. A story led to the next expedition, a find to even greater hopes. But it soon became clear that the true wealth of the Spanish colonies did not lie in gold alone. Silver became even more important. Silver was the metal that was to shape the Spanish Empire for centuries. The discovery of huge silver deposits in Potosí, in today's Bolivia, became particularly important. Cerro Rico, the rich mountain, became a symbol of colonial exploitation. In this mountain there were enormous quantities of silver ore. For Spain, Potosí was a gift of almost unimaginable value. For the people who had to work there, it became a place of suffering. Potosí quickly grew into one of the most important cities in the colonial world. People from different regions flocked there: Spanish officials, traders, priests, artisans, indigenous workers, enslaved Africans, and people who wanted to profit from the silver boom. In the streets of the city, luxury and misery met directly. While some became rich from trade, administration, or mining, others lived in catastrophic conditions. The wealth that reached Europe had its origin in dark tunnels, toxic fumes, and exhausted bodies. The work in the mines was dangerous and brutal. Indigenous workers had to descend deep into the mountain, cut ore, carry heavy loads, and work in conditions that destroyed their health. Collapses, lack of oxygen, dust, cold, and exhaustion were part of everyday life. Later, mercury was used in silver extraction to dissolve the metal from the ore. This process increased production, but poisoned people and the environment. Many workers died young, others returned to their villages sick. In order to get enough workers for the mines, the Spaniards resorted to existing forms of work and changed them in their favor. The mita system became particularly well known. Even in the Inca Empire, there had been a form of labor service in which communities did work for the state. Under Spanish rule, however, it became a system of coercion that primarily served the interests of the colonial economy. Entire village communities regularly had to put men to work in the mines. These people were torn out of their lives and forced into a world of work that had little in common with the former mutual commitment. The Spanish crown profited directly from this exploitation. Part of the precious metal production flowed to the king as a tax. The silver from South America financed wars, courting, administration, and Spain's claim to be a leading world power. It was transported to Europe, minted coins, paid soldiers, and flowed further into international trade networks. Spanish silver made its way not only to Europe, but also to Asia, especially China, where there was a great demand for silver. Thus, the mines of South America became part of a global economic system. But this global wealth was based on local violence. The landscapes around the mines have been changed. Forests have been cut down, water polluted, soils polluted, and villages depopulated. Traditional ways of doing business came under pressure because people, animals, and resources were put at the service of the mines. Agricultural communities had to give up workers and pay taxes at the same time. Many families lost fathers, brothers, or sons to mine work for months or years. The colonial economy sucked energy out of indigenous societies and turned it into wealth for others. In addition to Potosí, there were also other important mining regions. In Peru, in today's Bolivia, in Chile, and in other parts of South America, the Spaniards searched for precious metals. Not every search was successful, but the hope for new finds remained a driver of expansion. Again and again, men moved to unknown regions, followed rumors, and forced indigenous people to serve them as guides, porters, or workers. The legend of El Dorado, the fabled land of gold, is an example of how strongly the greed for wealth dominated the imagination of the conquerors. Entire expeditions were driven by this idea, although they often ended in hunger, violence, and failure. The greed for precious metals also influenced colonial society. Those who had access to mines, labor, or trade routes could gain enormous power. Spanish settlers, civil servants, and entrepreneurs fought for rights, licenses, and influence. Corruption was widespread. Many tried to get as much out of the system as possible before political conditions changed or a mine was exhausted. The colonial order promised wealth, but it also generated competition, deceit, and violence among the Spaniards themselves. For the indigenous population, the silver boom meant not only physical exploitation, but also cultural destruction. Many gold and silver objects that had previously been used in religious ceremonies were melted down. Temples were plundered, holy places desecrated, and works of art destroyed because their material value seemed more important than their meaning. This meant that not only objects were lost, but also memories, symbols, and connections to a religious world that the Spaniards did not want to understand or respect. At the same time, new forms of adaptation and survival emerged. Indigenous communities tried to escape forced labor, negotiate taxes, or protect people. Some fled to regions that are difficult to access. Others used colonial courts to sue against abuse, even if the chances of success were limited. Still others participated in trade around the mines, selling food, textiles, or services. The colonial economy was therefore not only a system of unilateral orders, but also a space in which people searched for possibilities of action under duress. Enslaved Africans also became part of this world. They were brought to various regions of the Spanish colonies and had to work in households, workshops, plantations, or sometimes also in mining contexts. Their history is also part of the history of colonial wealth. Spain's hunger for silver and gold was inseparable from the history of slavery. European expansion, African enslavement, and indigenous forced labor were intertwined. The wealth that flowed from South America to Europe changed not only Spain, but the entire world economy. Precious metals enabled trade, financed power politics, and strengthened the connection between continents. At the same time, they contributed to inflation, dependencies, and economic tensions. Spain became powerful through silver, but not necessarily permanently stable. A lot of money flowed into wars and debts, while other European powers benefited in the long term from trade, production, and financial systems. For South America, the balance remained devastating. The precious metals extracted from the mountains built palaces, financed armies, and filled treasuries far away from the place of their origin. But in the regions from which they came, they left behind destroyed communities, social inequality, and an economic order based on exploitation. The mountain of Potosi became the symbol of this history, a place that produced immeasurable wealth and at the same time devoured countless lives. The greed for gold and silver was therefore more than a personal vice of individual conquerors. It became the engine of an entire colonial system. It determined where expeditions would lead, which regions would become important, how labor would be organized, and how Spain would expand its power in America. Shiny metals gave rise to a dark system of coercion, control, and violence. But wealth alone could not rule an empire. In order to exploit the conquered territories permanently, Spain needed a fixed order. It had to establish cities, appoint officials, create laws, and secure the connection between America and Europe. Step by step, a colonial administration emerged from the chaos of conquest. This marks the beginning of the next chapter, the new order of the Viceroyalty and Spanish colonial rule. Chapter 7: The New Order, Viceroyalty and Colonial Administration. After conquering large parts of South America, the Spaniards were faced with a new challenge. It was no longer enough to defeat individual rulers, plunder cities, or rob gold and silver. If Spain wanted to secure its power in the long term, the conquest had to become a functioning rule. The crown needed control over vast territories, over millions of people, over mines, trade routes, ports, cities, and tax revenues. Step by step, therefore, a colonial order emerged from the chaos of the conquista. This new order was intended to prevent the conquistadors from becoming too powerful. Men like Francisco Pizarro had conquered in the name of the king, but they often acted in their own interests. They wanted land, wealth, titles, and labor. This was dangerous for the Spanish crown. If individual conquerors in America became independent princes, Spain could lose control. Therefore, the crown began to bind administration, judiciary, and business more closely to itself. America was not only to be the empire of adventurers, but the property of the Spanish king. The most important instrument of this control was the viceroyalty. A viceroy was the king's deputy overseas. Since the actual monarch lived in Spain and the journey across the Atlantic took a long time, he needed representatives to rule in his name. For South America, the viceroyalty of Peru was particularly decisive. It was founded in the 16th century and initially covered large parts of Spanish South America. Its capital became Lima, a city on the Pacific coast that was newly founded by the Spanish and soon rose to become the political center of the colonial power in South America. Lima was better suited for Spain than Cusco, the ancient heart of the Inca Empire. Cusco was located high in the Andes and was deeply connected to the memory of the Incas. Lima, on the other hand, was closer to the coast and was easier to connect to Pacific trade and connections to Panama, Mexico, and eventually Spain. So Lima's choice was not accidental. It showed that the Spaniards wanted to create a new order that broke away from the old centers of power of the Incas. Colonial South America was to be organized according to Spanish needs. The viceroy was at the head of this order. He had military, political, and economic tasks. It was supposed to protect the interests of the crown, collect taxes, organize defense, control the indigenous population, and monitor the exploitation of resources. But his power was not limitless. Spain distrusted too much independence in the colonies. Therefore, various institutions were created to monitor each other. Power was distributed so that no one in America became too strong. The audiencias played a central role. These were high courts that also had political significance. They were supposed to administer justice, examine complaints, and monitor the administration. In a world where the king was far away, such institutions could decide the lives of many people. Spanish settlers, clergy, indigenous representatives, and local elites turned to them when it came to land, work, taxes, or power struggles. Of course, This did not mean that all people were treated equally. Colonial justice was shaped by origin, money, relationships, and power. But it was an important part of Spanish rule. Cities also became supporting pillars of the colonial order. The Spaniards founded new cities or rebuilt existing places according to the Spanish model. In the center was usually a large square, the Plaza Mayor. Around it stood the most important buildings: church, town hall, administrative headquarters, and houses of the leading families. This urban planning was more than architecture. It was an expression of power. The square showed who ruled: the crown, the church, and the Spanish elite. The surrounding area was controlled from the cities. Officials, merchants, priests, soldiers, and large landowners lived here. Cities were places of trade, administration, justice, and social order. Whoever had power in a city could influence the distribution of land, labor, and economic opportunities. At the same time, cities became centers of cultural change. Spanish language, clothing, religion, and ways of life spread from them, even if they mixed with indigenous and African influences. But the administration of South America was difficult. The distances were huge, the landscapes extremely varied, and many regions were difficult to reach. Between Lima, the Andes, the mines of Potosí, the coastal ports, and the outskirts lay mountains, deserts, forests, and long distances. News could take weeks or months. Orders from Spain often arrived late, and by the time they arrived, conditions on the ground had sometimes already changed. That is why colonial rule has always been a struggle against distance. In order to exert control, the Spaniards partially adopted existing indigenous structures. This was especially important in the former territories of the Inca Empire. Local rulers, known as Caracas, often remained influential in their communities as long as they cooperated with the Spanish administration. They had to organize levies, provide labor, and pass on orders. For the Spaniards, they were useful because they knew the language, the people, and the local conditions. They could offer protection for the indigenous communities, but they could also become tools of colonial exploitation. Spanish rule was therefore not simply a complete replacement of the old order. It was a mixture of destruction, adaptation, and use of existing structures. The Inca administration was politically disempowered, but many of its ways, forms of work, and local hierarchies were still used by the Spaniards. What had previously served the Inca state now served the Spanish crown, the mine owners, and the colonial elites. Another important means of rule was the allocation of land and labor rights. In the early colonial period, encomiendas played a major role. In this case, a Spaniard was given the right to demand taxes or work from a group of indigenous people. Officially, he was supposed to protect them in return and have them instructed as Christians. In reality, this system often led to severe abuse. Many encomenderos treated the indigenous population as a personal source of labor and enriched themselves at their expense. The Crown realized that this system was dangerous, not out of pure humanity, but also out of political interest. Encomenderos that were too powerful could undermine the king's authority. Therefore, Spain tried to limit its power and replace it more with royal officials. New laws were created to regulate the treatment of the indigenous population. Some laws were intended to limit exploitation, but their implementation was difficult. Settlers, mine owners, and officials often had their own interests on the ground. There was a big gap between the laws in Spain and the reality in South America. The church was also a central part of the new order. It was not only responsible for religion, but also for education, morality, control, and cultural transformation. Bishops, religious orders, and missionaries built churches, monasteries, and schools. They baptized indigenous people, fought against old religious practices, and spread Christian ideas. At the same time, some clergymen documented indigenous languages, customs, and history. The church could protect, but also suppress. It was part of the colonial system, and at the same time sometimes a place where criticism of particularly brutal exploitation was formulated. The Spanish colonial administration was strongly hierarchical. At the top were people who were born in Spain. They often received the highest offices because the crown trusted them more than the American-born Spaniards. These American-born descendants of Spanish families were later called Creoles. They could be rich and influential, but often felt excluded from the highest political positions. This tension between Spaniards from Europe and Creoles in America would later play an important role on the road to independence. Below this elite lived a diverse society of mestizos, indigenous people, free blacks, enslaved Africans, and people of mixed origin. The administration tried to organize this society into categories. Origin, skin color, religion, legal status, and profession determined what opportunities a person had. The colonial order was therefore not only political, but also social. It determined who was allowed to rule, who had to work, who paid taxes, and who had access to education or offices. For the indigenous population, the new administration brought a double burden. On the one hand, they were now forced into a foreign legal system, had to pay taxes and perform labor services. On the other hand, some municipalities tried to use precisely this system to defend their rights. They sent representatives to court, invoked royal laws, or sued against excessive demands. The Spanish order was therefore not only an instrument of oppression, but also a field in which power, protection, and survival were fought for. Over time, the colonial administration became more and more dense. New offices were created, tax systems were expanded, trade rules were laid down, and military structures were created. Spain wanted to prevent other European powers from invading its territories. Ports, fleets, and trade routes were strictly controlled. Trade was to be carried out through Spanish channels as far as possible so that the crown would benefit from it. Smuggling was nevertheless widespread, because the colonies needed goods, and many traders wanted to circumvent the strict rules. The new order of the viceroyalty was therefore a huge project of domination. It connected Europe and South America in a system of administration, religion, violence, and economy. At the top was the king in Spain, but the actual rule was exercised by viceroys, judges, officials, priests, local elites, and local military. This system was powerful, but never completely stable. It was based on control, but also on compromise. It wanted to create unity, but had to live with diversity. It claimed absolute authority, but was constantly challenged by distance, corruption, resistance, and local interests. For Spain, this order was necessary in order to exploit the riches of South America permanently. For the colonial elites, it offered advancement, possession, and influence. For many indigenous and enslaved people, it meant coercion, taxes, and surveillance. But it also created the structures in which new societies developed: cities, markets, courts, churches, schools, and administrative centers that profoundly changed South America. The Conquest had become a colonial state. The Spaniards had not only taken land, but created institutions to control this land for centuries. But this control was not only secular. It was accompanied by a powerful religious claim. Spanish rule saw itself not only as a political order, but also as a Christian mission. Chapter 8: Mission and Forced Conversion. The Spanish conquest of South America was not only a military and economic project. It was also closely linked to religion from the beginning. The Spaniards came with soldiers, officials, and merchants, but also with priests, monks, and missionaries. In their eyes, the spread of Christianity was a sacred task. New territories were to be subjected not only to the Spanish king, but also to the Catholic faith. This connection between the crown and the church gave rise to one of the most powerful forces of the colonial era: missionary work. For the Spanish rulers, religion was an important means of justifying their conquests. They claimed that the people of America needed to be freed from their supposed ignorance and led to the true faith. From the Spanish point of view, this thought sounded like salvation and divine commission. For many indigenous societies, however, it meant coercion, control, and the attack on their own world. because their religions were not simply individual rituals that could be discarded. They were deeply connected to landscape, ancestors, dominion, agriculture, healing, and community. In the Andes, for example, mountains, springs, stones, caves, and special places had a spiritual meaning. Many of these sacred places were revered as huacas. They were part of a living cosmos in which humans, nature, gods, and ancestors were connected. The sun, the moon, the earth, and fertility also played an important role. Rituals ensured that this balance was maintained. Offerings, festivals, and ceremonies accompanied sowing, harvesting, birth, death, and political decisions. Religion was therefore not a demarcated area of life, but permeated everyday life. It was precisely this religious world that came under pressure. Missionaries came to towns and villages, built churches, preached the Christian faith, and baptized the indigenous population. They declared ancient gods to be idols, sacred places to be signs of the devil, and traditional rituals to be superstitions. Temples were destroyed or built over. Churches and monasteries were built on old places of worship. In doing so, the Spaniards not only wanted to replace buildings, but also to change the memory and meaning of these places. Where indigenous ceremonies had previously taken place, Mass was now to be celebrated. Particularly symbolic was the treatment of the religious centers of the Incas. In Cusco, the ancient heart of the Inca Empire, important sanctuaries were plundered, desecrated, and reinterpreted in a Christian way. The Temple of the Sun, once one of the most important places of the Inca religion, lost its original function. Colonial architecture settled on the foundations of the defeated culture. To this day, such places show how closely destruction and reshaping were connected. The Spaniards did not always completely wipe everything out, but they tried to impose their own order on top of it. Baptism played a central role in this process. For the Church, it was the entry into the Christian community. For many indigenous people, however, it was difficult to understand at first. Often, people were baptized in large numbers without being fully aware of the teachings of Christianity or having accepted them voluntarily. Missionaries were faced with the problem that they wanted to convey a religion whose terms had no direct equivalent in many indigenous languages. What did sin, redemption, the Trinity, or hell mean in a world that had very different ideas about the relationship between humans and supernatural forces? Therefore, some missionaries learned indigenous languages. They wrote dictionaries, grammars, catechisms, and sermon texts. Quechua, Aymara, Guarani, and other languages were partly used to spread Christian teachings. This had contradictory consequences. On the one hand, it served the mission and thus colonial control. On the other hand, indigenous languages were documented and partly preserved as a result. Some clerics became important observers of indigenous cultures, even if their gaze was often shaped by religious prejudices. However, the Church was not a unified force. There were missionaries who treated the indigenous population brutally or worked closely with colonial rulers. But there were also clerics who criticized mistreatment and spoke out against the worst forms of exploitation. Some saw the indigenous people as vulnerable Christians who had to be protected from the greed of the settlers. This criticism did not fundamentally change the colonial system, but it shows that there were tensions within the Church. Mission and protection, submission and care, education and control were often close together. The religious orders became particularly important. Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, Mercedarians, and later Jesuits played a major role in missionary work. They founded monasteries, schools, and mission stations. In remote regions, they tried to bring indigenous groups together in so-called reductions or mission settlements. There, people were supposed to live according to Christian ideas, go to church regularly, work, and be under supervision. From the missionaries' point of view, such settlements should bring order and faith. From the point of view of many indigenous people, they mean loss of freedom of movement, control over everyday life, and separation from old ways of life. The Jesuits became especially known for their missions in areas where Guarani lived. Missionary communities arose there, which developed their own economic and religious structure. They offered some indigenous people protection from enslavement and brutal exploitation by settlers. At the same time, they remained part of the colonial mission project. There too, the indigenous religion was fought, work was organized, and life was organized according to Christian rules. The history of missions is therefore not simply a story of oppression or protection, but a contradictory mixture of both. The forced conversion did not always manifest itself in open violence. It often worked through permanent pressure. Anyone who wanted to survive in the colonial system had to adapt to Christian rituals. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals were regulated by the church. Sunday services, confession, veneration of saints, and Christian holidays structured life. Those who adhered to old rituals risked punishment, public humiliation, or persecution. The church intervened deeply in family life, sexuality, education, and community. Religion thus became a tool of social control. But indigenous religions did not simply disappear. Many people adopted Christian elements without completely abandoning their old ideas. Hybrid forms emerged in which saints were associated with older protective powers, or Christian festivals merged with traditional meanings. The Virgin Mary could be associated with ideas of Mother Earth. Saints could take on roles that used to have local guardian spirits or ancestors. On the outside, some congregations appeared Christian, while on the inside, older interpretations lived on. This mixing was a form of survival. Especially in the Andes, the relationship to the landscape remained important. Mountains, fields, water springs, and ancestors did not lose their importance simply because missionaries forbade them. Many rituals were continued secretly or embedded in Christian forms. People learned to mediate between the expectations of the colonial power and their own traditions. They could go to church and still believe in the power of holy places. They were able to say Christian prayers and at the same time preserve older forms of interpretation of the world. For the Spaniards, this religious mixing was often suspicious. Again and again there were campaigns against alleged idolatry. Clergy and officials searched for hidden sanctuaries, destroyed offerings, and punished religious specialists. Such actions show that the missionary work was never completely completed. If the church repeatedly took action against old practices, it was because they continued to exist. Resistance to forced conversion was not always an open uprising. It often consisted of quietly preserving, reinterpreting, and passing on knowledge within the community. Missionary work also changed education. Monasteries and church schools became important places of learning, especially for the sons of local elites. The Spaniards hoped to exert influence on the entire indigenous population through these elites. Those who could read, write, and understand Christian teachings would later serve as mediators. However, some indigenous nobles also used this education for their own purposes. They wrote complaints, litigated, preserved memories of their origins, or negotiated with colonial authorities. So education was also a double-edged tool. The church also shaped art, music, and architecture. In many regions, churches, altars, paintings, and sculptures were created that combined European motifs with indigenous forms. Artists from local communities worked for church patrons, bringing their own styles, colors, and symbols. The result was a colonial art that was not simply European, but emerged from the encounter and tension of different traditions. Even in works that were supposed to serve the mission, traces of indigenous creativity can be found. Despite this cultural mixing, the violence of forced conversion must not be trivialized. For many people, it meant the loss of sacred objects, the destruction of temples, the persecution of religious specialists, and the pressure to hide their beliefs. The mission intervened in the innermost part of communities. It changed names, rituals, calendars, family forms, and ideas of good and evil. It was a spiritual part of the conquest. At the same time, the Catholic Church was one of the most enduring influences of the Spanish colonial period. To this day, Catholicism is strongly present in many South American countries. But he is not simply a copy of the Spanish faith from the 16th century. It has been changed, adapted, and interwoven with local traditions. In processions, festivals, images of saints, and popular religiosity, many layers of history live on: Spanish missions, indigenous memory, African influences, and local forms of faith. Missionary work, therefore, shows particularly clearly how colonial rule worked. It destroyed and created something new at the same time. It forced people to conform, but could not fully control what they believed. It brought about oppression, but also new forms of expression. It was a tool of power, but people did not always make of it what the colonial masters intended. In the end, there was a society in which religion was omnipresent. Churches dominated the squares of the cities. Bells structured the day. Priests accompanied birth, marriage, and death. Christian festivals marked the course of the year. But under this visible order, older memories lived on. The spiritual world of South America was not extinguished, but changed, hidden, and reassembled. The Spanish rule wanted to control bodies and souls. It demanded work, taxes, and obedience, but also faith. But it was precisely where she wanted to intervene most deeply that she met with quiet persistence. People could be forced to enter a church, but not completely forced to forget their world. Thus, the history of the mission leads directly to the next big theme of the colonial era: work, exploitation, and resistance. While the church promised to save souls, the colonial economy forced millions of people into ministries, mines, fields, and workshops. Chapter 9: Work, Exploitation, and Resistance. Spanish colonial rule in South America was not only based on weapons, religion, and administration. It was based primarily on work. Without the labor of indigenous people, enslaved Africans, and later many people of mixed origin, the colonial system would not have worked. The mines had yielded no silver, the fields had produced no harvests, the cities had received no houses, churches, and roads. Behind Spain's wealth were millions of bodies that were forced to work for a foreign empire. Shortly after the conquest, it became clear that the Spaniards did not only want land and precious metals. They wanted to control people. Because land alone did not bring wealth if no one cultivated it. Silver remained worthless in the mountain if no one broke it out. Cities were not created by orders, but by hard work. Therefore, the indigenous population was made one of the most important resources of the colonial empire. An early instrument of this exploitation was the encomienda. In this case, a Spanish conqueror or settler was given the right to demand taxes or work from a certain indigenous community. Officially, he was supposed to protect these people and ensure that they were instructed in the Christian faith. In theory, this sounded like a mutual commitment. In reality, it was often a system of brutal exploitation. Many encomenderos treated the people assigned to them as personal possessions. They demanded food, textiles, precious metals, or labor services, and used violence if their demands were not met. For the Spanish crown, the encomienda was both useful and dangerous. It rewarded conquistadors without having to pay them money directly. At the same time, it made individual settlers very powerful. Some encomenderos ruled in their territories almost like petty princes. Therefore, the crown later tried to limit its power. New laws should better protect the indigenous population and place control more in royal hands. But there was a great distance between law and reality. In remote regions, local rulers were able to continue to exert enormous pressure. Forced labor in the mines became even more drastic. The silver of Potosi in particular made the labor of indigenous people a central part of the colonial economy. In order to get enough workers, the Spaniards resorted to the mita system. The Incas had already had labor services, but under Spanish rule this system was radically changed. What had previously been embedded in an order of mutual obligations now became a tool of colonial exploitation. Village communities regularly had to put men to work in the mines. These were torn from their families and fields and sent to dangerous mining regions. The work was hard, poorly paid, and life-threatening. Many had to dig deep into the tunnels, mine or carry loads, and work under conditions that opened the door to disease and early death. Dust, cold, darkness, exhaustion, and toxic substances determined everyday life. In particular, the use of mercury in silver mining made the work even more dangerous. Those who were sent to the mines often did not know whether they would return. The mita burdened not only the individual workers, but entire communities. When men are missing, fields, families, and local economies suffer. Women, children, and the elderly had to take on additional tasks. Some villages became impoverished because they had to deliver labor, taxes, and food at the same time. The colonial economy thus intervened deeply in the social fabric. It destroyed not only bodies, but also communities. But work in the colony was not limited to mines. On country estates, in workshops, in road construction, in households, on plantations, and in cities, people had to work for the colonial order. In many regions, large estates, so-called haciendas, were built. Agricultural products for cities, mines, and markets were produced there. Indigenous workers were tied to these goods through debt, dependency, or direct coercion. Some people found themselves in a situation from which they could hardly escape because they were constantly in debt to their employers or were made legally and economically dependent. Enslaved Africans also played an important role in the colonial world of work. They were carried across the Atlantic and used in various parts of South America, in households, on plantations, in craft businesses, in ports, in transport, and in some mining regions. Their exploitation was based on a system that declared people to be property. They could be sold, bequeathed, punished, and torn from their families. Their history is a central part of South American colonial history, even if it is often less central than the history of the indigenous population. The working world of the colony was thus characterized by coercion, inequality, and violence. But it was not the same everywhere. In some regions, the indigenous population was more densely integrated and more closely integrated into old communities. There, the Spaniards were able to use existing structures. In other areas, especially on coasts or in plantation farms, the work of enslaved Africans became more important. In cities, on the other hand, other forms of work emerged. Craftsmen, porters, servants, merchants, construction workers, cooks, tailors, and many others shaped colonial life. Resistance to this exploitation took many forms. Not every resistance was a great uprising. It often began on a small scale. People worked more slowly, fled, hid supplies, refused to pay taxes, feigned illness, or exploited unclear responsibilities of the administration. Some village communities tried to downplay their duties or give false population figures in order to have to provide fewer workers. Others turned to colonial courts, filed complaints, and invoked royal laws to protect them from excessive exploitation. These legal strategies show that indigenous people not only suffered the colonial system, but also tried to take advantage of it. They learned what language officials understood, which documents were important, and how to formulate claims. Local guides, scribes, and interpreters thus became important mediators. Of course, the chances were unevenly distributed. Spanish elites had more influence, money, and contacts. But even limited legal options could be important for communities to defend land, labor, or religious rights. In addition, flight was a common form of resistance. People left villages, mines, or country estates to evade the obligation to work. Some moved to hard-to-reach areas. Others sought shelter in cities or other communities. Enslaved Africans also fled and founded independent communities in some regions, which became known as palenques or quilombos. Such communities were expressions of determined resistance to enslavement and colonial control. They showed that even under extreme conditions, the desire for freedom could not be extinguished. Again and again, there were also open riots. These could be locally limited or cover larger regions. The causes were often excessive taxes, abuse by officials, forced labor, land grabbing, or attacks on religious traditions. Some uprisings were directed against individuals who were particularly brutal, others against the colonial system as a whole. Social, economic, and religious motives were often combined. Those who fought against work obligations often fought simultaneously for the dignity of their own community, for the preservation of land, and for the memory of an earlier order. The Spaniards usually reacted to resistance with harsh violence. Uprisings were suppressed, leaders executed, communities punished, and structures tightened. But repression never completely solved the problem. The colonial order remained dependent on people who did not wear it voluntarily. Therefore, she had to constantly monitor, negotiate, and punish. It is precisely this constant necessity that shows that the rule was not as stable as it wanted to appear to the outside world. New social relationships also emerged within the colonial world of work. Indigenous, African, and European people worked side by side, lived in the same cities or met in markets, estates, and households. This led to conflicts, but also to exchange, solidarity, and cultural mixing. People shared techniques, languages, food, religious ideas, and survival strategies. The colonial world of work was brutal, but it also became a place where new societies emerged. For Spain, the exploitation of labor was an economic success. Silver, agricultural products, and taxes flowed into the coffers of the crown and the colonial elites. But this success came at a high price. It was based on suffering, coercion, and deep social inequality, the consequences of which are still visible today. Many regions of South America were forced into economic forms that primarily served exports and the needs of foreign markets. Local development, self-determination, and balanced supply were subordinated to colonial profit. The history of work and exploitation, therefore, shows the core of Spanish colonial rule. It wasn't just about owning land or converting people. It was about organizing, controlling, and transforming labor into wealth. The bodies of the subjugated became the engine of the empire. Mines, fields, cities, and churches were visible signs of this work. But behind them were stories of pain, adaptation, and resistance. Despite all the violence, the colonial power never succeeded in completely breaking the people. Indigenous communities preserved forms of communal life. Enslaved people fought for freedom, family, and memory. Workers fled, sued, negotiated, or rose up. Resistance was not always victorious, but it was permanent. He accompanied colonial rule from the very beginning and showed that exploitation never remained without resistance. This world of work gave rise to a society that was strictly ordered and deeply divided. Origin, skin color, legal status, and proximity to Spanish power decided who ruled and who had to serve. The colonial order divided people into groups and made these divisions a cornerstone of everyday life. This is the beginning of the next chapter, the society of the colony, in which origin decided on opportunities, rights, and reputation. Chapter 10, Society of the Colony, Origin Decides. The Spanish colonies in South America were characterized not only by violence, religion, and work, but also by a strictly ordered society. Those who were born in this world did not have the same opportunities as others. Origin, skin color, place of birth, religion, property, and legal status decided what rights a person had, what work he had to do, what profession he could practice, and how much prestige he was accorded. Colonial society was a world of hierarchy. Everyone should have a place, and this place was rarely freely chosen. At the top were the Spaniards, who were born on the Iberian Peninsula. They were often referred to as peninsulars. For the Spanish crown, they were considered particularly trustworthy because they came directly from Europe and seemed to be more closely connected to the motherland. They often received the highest offices in administration, church, and military. Viceroys, high judges, bishops, and important officials mostly came from Spain itself. In this way, the crown wanted to ensure that the colonies did not become too independent and that the most important decisions were made in the king's interest. But this preference led to tensions. Because many people of Spanish descent who were born there also lived in America. They were called Creoles. Many Creoles were rich, owned land, mines, or trading companies, and considered themselves the rightful elite of the colonies. They spoke Spanish, were Catholic, and saw themselves as part of the Spanish world. Nevertheless, they were often excluded from the highest political offices. Over time, this setback became a source of growing discontent. Many Creoles wondered why men who had little experience of the conditions in America should rule over them just because they were born in Spain. Below the European and Creole elite were people of mixed origin. The mestizos, i.e. descendants of Europeans and indigenous people, were particularly important. Their number grew sharply in the course of the colonial period. They lived in cities, villages, mining regions, and border areas. Some worked as craftsmen, soldiers, traders, farmers, or servants. Their position varied. Some were able to achieve social advancement, especially if they had education, property, or connections. Others lived in poverty and were despised by the Spanish elite. Colonial society often saw them as people between worlds, not fully Spanish, not fully indigenous in the legal and social sense. The indigenous population continued to form a large part of society. Although their empires had been defeated and their political structures had been greatly altered, indigenous communities persisted in many regions. They lived in villages, farmed land, paid taxes, and had to do labor service. The Spanish crown officially regarded them as subjects who were to be protected and proselytized. In reality, however, they were particularly affected by exploitation. They had to pay tributes, provide men for the mita, and submit to the interference of officials, priests, and landowners. Nevertheless, indigenous people were not simply without rights. Their position was contradictory. On the one hand, they were suppressed and patronized. On the other hand, the crown recognized certain communities, local leaders, and land rights because it needed these structures for administration and tax collection. Indigenous nobles were able to retain influence in some regions, especially if they collaborated with the colonial power. Some received Christian education, held titles, and appeared before colonial courts. But their power was limited and constantly dependent on Spanish interests. Another important part of colonial society were people of African descent. Many of them had been deported to South America as enslaved. They worked in households, on plantations, in workshops, in ports, in transportation, or in other areas of the colonial economy. Enslaved people were legally at the bottom of the order because they were treated as property. They could be sold, punished, and separated from their families. Nevertheless, they developed their own communities, cultural traditions, and forms of resistance. Some were able to gain their freedom, for example by ransoming, releasing, or fleeing. Free blacks and people of mixed African descent also played an important role. In the colonial categories, they were often referred to by terms such as mulattoes or zambos, although these terms are problematic from today's perspective because they divided people according to origin and skin color. For the colonial administration, such categories were a means of establishing order. For those affected, they could decide on taxes, professions, marriage opportunities, and social standing. But in everyday life, the boundaries were often less clear than the official lists indicated. Spanish colonial society developed a complicated system of divisions, which was later called the caste system. People were sorted according to their ancestry: Spaniards, Creoles, mestizos, indigenous, Africans, mulattoes, zambos, and many other mixed categories. In paintings, administrative documents, and church registers, attempts were made to make this order visible. Behind this was the idea that the origin and purity of blood would say about the value of a person. This way of thinking combined social power with racist ideas, even if the terms and structures were different than in later centuries. But reality was often more complicated than theory. In cities, people of different origins met every day at markets, in churches, workshops, households, and streets. People married, had children, worked together, traded with each other, and lived next door to each other. Money, clothing, profession, language, and behavior could change a person's perception. Those who were rich, spoke Spanish, dressed European, and had good connections could sometimes be held in higher esteem than those whose origins were officially rated lower. Conversely, poverty could mean social decline, even for people of European descent. The cities in particular were places of social mix. Lima, Quito, Bogota, Potosí, Cusco, and other colonial centers were full of people of different origins. Indigenous women sold food in the markets. Mestizos worked as craftsmen or transporters. Enslaved and free blacks performed services. Spanish officials went about their business. Priests supervised religious life, and merchants organized the flow of goods. The city was a place of control, but also of encounter. New languages, manners, food, musical genres, and social relationships emerged here. The church played an important role in classifying the people. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals were registered by the church. These documents often recorded the group to which someone was assigned. In this way, origin was made bureaucratically visible. At the same time, the church was one of the few places where all groups were at least theoretically part of the same Christian community. In practice, however, people of different origins did not always sit next to each other on an equal footing. Social differences were also reflected in churches, through seats, brotherhoods, processions, and access to church offices. Brotherhoods were particularly interesting. They were religious associations that organized festivals, provided social assistance, and supported members in the event of illness or death. There were brotherhoods for Spaniards, indigenous people, blacks, mestizos, or certain professions. For people who otherwise had little power, such communities could be important. They offered cohesion, visibility, and sometimes protection. At the same time, they often confirmed the separation of society into different groups. Women experienced the colonial order in a special way. Their social status depended heavily on origin, marriage, family, and property. Spanish and Creole women from rich families were able to strengthen political and economic networks through marriage. Many lived under strict ideas of honor, chastity, and family control. Indigenous, African, and mixed women often worked in markets, in households, in fields, or in textile production. They contributed significantly to the economy, but often had little legal protection. At the same time, women were able to use room for maneuver in certain areas, as traders, healers, mediators, owners of small goods, or keepers of cultural traditions. Colonial society was therefore not just a simple pyramid, but a mobile, contradictory system. At the top were the representatives of Spain and the rich elite. At the bottom stood those whose work and bodies were exploited. In between, there were many groups whose position could change depending on the region, profession, wealth, and relationships. Nevertheless, the basic rule remained clear. The closer someone was assigned to the Spanish, European, and Catholic elite, the greater his chances of power and prestige. This order served to stabilize colonial rule. When people were divided into groups, the administration could more easily determine who paid tributes, who had to work, who was allowed to carry weapons, who had access to offices, and who appeared more credible in court. The division of people was therefore not a secondary aspect, but a tool of power. It helped to portray inequality as a seemingly natural order. But this order also created tensions. Creoles felt disadvantaged by Spaniards from Europe. Mestizos sought recognition and advancement. Indigenous communities fought for land and protection. Enslaved people fought for freedom. Free blacks and people of mixed origin resisted exclusion and contempt. Colonial society was therefore constantly on the move. Beneath the surface of rank and order, there were conflicts, negotiations, and resistance. In the long term, this social structure had profound consequences. Many social inequalities that arose or were exacerbated during the colonial era continued to have an impact after independence. The question of who was considered civilized, pure, educated, or capable of dominating did not simply disappear with the end of Spanish rule. Even after the founding of independent states, indigenous, African-born, and poor population groups often remained disadvantaged. The colonial hierarchy lived on in new forms. Chapter 10 therefore shows that colonial rule did not only work through armies and laws. It also worked through ideas about who was worth more than others. Spanish colonial society ordered people according to their origin and made this order the foundation of everyday life. But in this everyday life, new identities, new cultures, and new conflicts emerged at the same time. Because despite all the borders, people lived together, worked together, celebrated festivals, founded families, and created new ways of life. The colony was a place of oppression, but also a place of mixing. The next chapter shows how these people actually lived, what they ate, how they lived, worked, believed, and celebrated everyday life in the colonies. Chapter 11: Everyday life in the colonies. When one thinks of the Spanish colonies in South America, the focus is often on major events: the conquest of the Inca Empire, the silver mines of Potosi, the power of the viceroys, or the uprisings against colonial rule. But history does not only consist of battles, laws, and rulers. It also consists of everyday life. From life in markets and fields, in churches and workshops, in mines and households, in cities, villages, and mission stations. Especially in everyday life, it became clear how deeply Spanish colonial rule intervened in people's lives. Everyday life was very different. A Spanish official in Lima lived in a different world than an indigenous farmer in the Andes, an enslaved woman in an urban household, or a miner in Potosi. The colony was not a unified society, but a network of many worlds. Origin, occupation, gender, place of residence, and property determined how a person lived, worked, and was treated. Nevertheless, there were experiences that united many people: work, religion, social control, and the constant attempt to survive in an unequal order. Colonial life was particularly visible in the cities. Cities such as Lima, Cusco, Quito, Bogota, or Potosi were centers of administration, trade, church, and power. Their structure mostly followed Spanish ideas. In the center was a large square, the Plaza Mayor. The most important buildings stood there: the cathedral, the town hall, administrative buildings, and the houses of the influential families. The square was not only a place of traffic, but a stage of power. Processions were held here, announcements were read, markets were organized, and sometimes punishments were carried out in public. Life in the city was loud, dense, and diverse. Merchants called out their wares, animals were led through the streets, bells set the rhythm of the day, and people of different origins met in a confined space. Spaniards, Creoles, mestizos, indigenous people, free blacks, and enslaved people did not live equally, but they shared many spaces of everyday life. Corn, potatoes, fruit, meat, fish, spices, textiles, ceramics, and tools were sold at markets. Markets were places of trade, but also places of exchange. News spread quickly there, as did rumors, complaints, and political moods. Women in particular play an important role in many markets. Indigenous and mestizo women sold food, textiles, or handicraft products. They supplied cities with goods from the surrounding area and made a decisive contribution to the economy. Despite their important work, they were often socially disregarded and legally disadvantaged. But it was precisely in everyday life that they were able to gain room for maneuver. Anyone who sold goods, knew customers, and negotiated prices had knowledge, contacts, and a certain independence. In the villages, everyday life looked different. Many indigenous communities continued to live from agriculture, livestock farming, and community work. They grew corn, potatoes, beans, quinoa, and other plants, kept llamas or alpacas, and used old knowledge about soils, altitudes, and seasons. But colonial rule changed this way of life. People had to pay tributes, perform labor services, and abide by church rules. Fields that used to serve the supply of the community were more closely integrated into colonial markets. Some villages had to deliver food for cities or mines. Others lost land to Spanish settlers, churches, or haciendas. The hacienda became an important place of everyday life for many people. These large estates produced food, livestock, wine, sugar, or other goods. Indigenous people, mestizos, free arms, and partly enslaved Africans worked on them. Some workers were bound to the estate by debts. Others had few alternatives because their communities had lost land. Everyday life on a hacienda was characterized by hard work, dependency, and strict hierarchy. The owner or manager decided on working hours, penalties, wages, and access to land. Everyday life in the mining regions was even harder. Potosi was the most famous example. The city grew to enormous size due to silver, but its wealth was based on dangerous work. Miners descended into dark tunnels, carrying heavy loads and breathing in dust and toxic fumes. Many came from distant communities as part of the mita, i.e. forced labor. For them, Potosi meant separation from family, illness, exhaustion, and often death. At the same time, a whole everyday world emerged around the mines. Traders, cooks, porters, craftsmen, priests, inns, markets, and accommodation supplied the city. Where silver was mined, poverty, hope, violence, and survival strategies also emerged. Religion structured everyday life almost everywhere. The bells of the churches called for Mass, Christian festivals ordered the year, and priests accompanied birth, marriage, and death. Sundays, saints' days, processions, and confessions were part of colonial life. The church was not only a place of faith, but also a place of social control. It determined which relationships were permitted, which rituals were considered Christian, and which practices were persecuted. Those who did not show up for Mass or continued old religious customs could be punished or publicly shamed. But religion was not simply imposed in everyday life. Many people made it their own in their own way. Christian saints were associated with local ideas, festivals took on new meanings, and old rituals lived on in a different form. In processions, music, dances, and offerings, European, indigenous, and African elements merged. The colonial church wanted to create unity, but diversity arose in everyday life. People could be officially Catholic and at the same time preserve older ideas about mountains, ancestors, earth, or guardian spirits. Clothing also showed social order. Spanish elites wore fabrics, cuts, and jewelry that made their rank visible. Clothing was a sign of origin, wealth, and aspiration. Indigenous people often wore traditional textiles, but these were influenced by colonial regulations and new materials. In some times and regions, the authorities even tried to regulate clothing in order to keep social differences visible. Anyone who dressed like a higher group could be perceived as a threat to order. Clothing was therefore not only protection from the weather, but a language of society. Food was another field of mixing. The Spanish colonial period brought new animals and plants to South America: cattle, pigs, sheep, chickens, wheat, vines, and much more. At the same time, the Spaniards and their descendants adopted many American foods such as corn, potatoes, beans, tomatoes, chili, cocoa, and various fruits. In kitchens, at markets, and at dining tables, a new food culture emerged. What people ate depended heavily on their status. Rich families could enjoy imported goods, meat, and wine, while poor people lived on simple staple foods. But it was precisely the mixture of European and American ingredients that shaped the cuisine of South America in the long term. The household was another important place of everyday life. Servants, indigenous workers, or enslaved people worked in rich Spanish or Creole houses. Meals were prepared there, clothes were cared for, children were cared for, and social relationships were organized. The house was not only a private space, but also a place of hierarchy. Who served and who was served showed the order of the colony on a small scale. For enslaved women and men, the household could be both a place of close control and a place of difficult room for maneuver. They knew family secrets, built relationships, and looked for ways to achieve freedom or better conditions. Education was unevenly distributed. The sons of Spanish and Creole elites were able to attend schools, sometimes even universities. They learned reading, writing, Latin, religion, and law. Education prepared them for offices in the church, administration, or trade. Indigenous elites also received Christian education in some cases, especially if the Spaniards wanted to use it as mediators. However, most people did not have access to higher education. Knowledge was passed on in everyday life, through work, family, rituals, stories, crafts, and experience. Leisure time and festivals played a major role despite the harsh living conditions. Religious holidays, markets, weddings, baptisms, music, dances, and local celebrations provided moments of community. Festivals could confirm the colonial order if they honored the church and the crown. But they were also able to create spaces in which oppressed groups retained their own forms of expression. Music and dance became particularly important carriers of cultural memory. African rhythms, indigenous melodies, and European instruments influenced each other and created new forms that continue to have an impact today. At the same time, everyday life was characterized by fear and control. Public punishments, social surveillance, church morals, and the violence of owners or officials reminded people that the colony was an unequal order. Indigenous communities had to expect visits from tax collectors. Enslaved people lived under the threat of punishment and sale. Poor people could quickly find themselves in need due to debt, illness, or crop failures. Everyday life was therefore often a constant balancing act, obeying, evading, negotiating, adapting, or resisting. Nevertheless, life in the colonies was not only determined by oppression. People started families, loved, argued, celebrated, worked, traded, and told stories. They built relationships, created new traditions, and sought meaning in a world that had changed profoundly. Especially in everyday life, it becomes clear that colonial history is not just a history of the powerful. It is also the story of those who cooked, built, sewed, prayed, traded, sang, fled, negotiated, and survived. Everyday life in the Spanish colonies was thus a mirror of the entire colonial world. It showed power and resistance, separation and mixing, violence and creativity. The Spanish rule tried to arrange people according to origin and status, but these people met constantly on the streets, markets, in kitchens, churches, and workshops. These encounters gave rise to new ways of life, new identities, and new cultures. Thus, the view of everyday life leads directly to the next chapter: cultural mixing and identity. Because in the colonies, not only old things were destroyed, something new also emerged, shaped by Europe, America, and Africa at the same time. Chapter 12: Cultural Mixing and Identity. The Spanish colonial period in South America was an era of violence, subjugation, and exploitation. But it was also a time in which people of different origins lived together in a confined space and new forms of culture emerged. Spanish, indigenous, and African influences met in cities, villages, mines, ports, mission stations, and households. These encounters gave rise to new languages, customs, forms of music, food, religious practices, and identities. This cultural mixing was not a peaceful exchange at eye level. It happened in a world full of inequality. But that is precisely why it is so important to understand South America to this day. The Spanish conquerors wanted to impose their own culture, language, and religion. Spanish became the language of the administration, the courts, the church, and the colonial elite. If you wanted to have power, you had to speak Spanish or at least be able to deal with Spanish institutions. But the indigenous languages did not disappear. Quechua, Aymara, Guarani, and many other languages remained alive in everyday life. In some regions, they were even used by missionaries to spread Christian doctrines. This is how a bilingual or multilingual world emerged. People switched between languages depending on the situation, at the market, in church, in court, or within the family. Language thus became a sign of identity and power. Spanish opened doors to colonial administration, but could also be perceived as a symbol of submission. Indigenous languages preserve memories, worldviews, and communities. Many terms from these languages became part of everyday South American life, especially for plants, animals, food, landscapes, and religious ideas. To this day, many places, dishes, and traditions bear names that originate from pre-colonial languages. The language thus shows that colonial rule wanted to dominate, but could never completely replace everything. Cultural mixing in religion became particularly clear. The Spanish missionaries tried to impose the Catholic faith and displace indigenous religions. But in everyday life, Christian forms mixed with older ideas. Saints could take on characteristics that were previously attributed to local protective powers, ancestors, or natural forces. In some regions, the Virgin Mary was associated with ideas of fertility, earth, and maternal protection. Processions, festivals, and pilgrimages were given meanings that went far beyond the official teaching of the Church. In the Andes, the relationship with the landscape remained particularly important. Mountains, springs, and fields continued to be experienced as powerful places, even if they were now embedded in a Christian symbolic world. People could go to Mass, say Christian prayers, and at the same time believe in the importance of holy mountains or ancestors. For the colonial church, this mixing was often suspicious. For the local people, it was an opportunity to continue old ties in a new order. In this way, religion became a space of survival and adaptation. African influences also shaped the religious culture of South America. Enslaved people brought with them memories of their own beliefs, rituals, music, and forms of communal spirituality. Under the conditions of slavery, these traditions could not continue unchanged, but they did not disappear either. They connected with Catholic saints, brotherhoods, festivals, and local practices. It was precisely in coastal regions and cities that forms of religious culture emerged in which African, European, and indigenous elements worked together. Music and dance were particularly strong carriers of cultural mixing. European instruments, African rhythms, and indigenous melodies collided. In festivals, processions, family celebrations, and public gatherings, new forms of expression developed. The authorities repeatedly tried to control certain dances or celebrations because they suspected disorder, resistance, or moral danger there. But it was precisely these spaces that were important for many people. Music and dance allowed expression, community, and remembrance, even where open political power was lacking. The cuisine of the colonies also became a place of mixing. The Spaniards brought cattle, pigs, sheep, chickens, wheat, wine, olive oil, and other products to South America. At the same time, they adopted foods that had been grown in America for a long time: corn, potatoes, beans, tomatoes, chili, cocoa, cassava, quinoa, and many fruits. African cooking traditions and techniques were added. New dishes were created in the kitchens of cities, country estates, monasteries, and simple households. Today's South American cuisine is hardly conceivable without this mixture. It bears traces of coercion, trade, adaptation, and creativity. Clothing and crafts also changed. Indigenous textile traditions were already highly developed before the Spanish conquest. In the colonial era, they were associated with European materials, patterns, and dress standards. Some items of clothing became signs of social belonging. Spanish elites wanted to stand out through certain fabrics, cuts, and colors. Indigenous and mixed population groups held on to their own forms, but adapted them to new conditions, so clothing could show subordination, but also express pride and cultural independence. In art, the mixture was particularly visible. Churches, altars, paintings, and sculptures often followed European models, but were created by local artists. They brought in their own visual worlds, colors, techniques, and symbols. In some depictions of Christian themes, plants, animals, or landscapes of South America appeared. Angels, saints, and biblical scenes could contain elements that were clearly from the local world. The result was a colonial art that was neither purely Spanish nor purely indigenous. It was an expression of a society in which power and creativity were inextricably linked. Identity became more and more complex in this world. The colonial administration tried to divide people into fixed categories: Spaniards, Creoles, Mestizos, Indigenous, Africans, Mulattoes, Zambos, and many other groups. But actual life rarely fit neatly into these pigeonholes. People married across borders, had children, moved to cities, changed professions, learned new languages, and adapted their appearance. Identity was negotiated in everyday life. The mestizos in particular stood for this new colonial reality. They were children of different worlds, and yet were often viewed critically by both sides. For some, opportunities opened up as mediators, soldiers, craftsmen, or traders. Others remained socially disadvantaged. Their existence posed a problem for the colonial order. If society was to be based on clear borders, what did people who carried these borders within themselves mean? Over time, this mixed population became an important part of many South American societies. Creoles also developed a special identity. They were of Spanish origin, but born in America. They often felt connected to Spanish culture, but at the same time developed a growing awareness of their own American homeland. They knew the landscape, the cities, the economies, and the social relations of the colonies better than many officials from Europe. Nevertheless, the highest offices often remained closed to them. This tension gave rise to a new self-image, no longer just Spanish, but also not yet fully national in the modern sense. This Creole consciousness later became important for the independence movements. Indigenous identities also changed, but did not disappear. Many communities preserved their languages, forms of community work, memories of origins, and ties to land. At the same time, they had to deal with colonial categories, Christian religion, and Spanish administration. An indigenous community leader could be baptized as a Christian, use Spanish documents, and still represent the interests of his community according to old ideas. Identity was therefore not a rigid inheritance, but a strategy of survival. For people of African descent, identity was particularly marked by violence, but also by resistance. Enslavement sought to separate people from their communities of origin, languages, and families. Nevertheless, new Afro-South American cultures emerged. African memories lived on in music, religion, body techniques, narratives, food, and forms of community, connecting with the colonial environment. Free blacks, escaped enslaved, and their descendants created spaces of their own belonging, even if society discriminated against them. Cultural mixing did not mean that all differences disappeared. On the contrary, many hybrid forms arose precisely because people were under pressure. They had to adapt in order to survive and at the same time preserved parts of their origins. Sometimes mixing was voluntary and creative, sometimes forced and painful. A Christian festival could be an expression of genuine piety and at the same time carry older meanings. A Spanish word could live on in an indigenous language. A European instrument could accompany African rhythms. This created a culture that was full of tensions. The Spanish colonial power wanted to create order, but it created a world that was constantly changing. She wanted clear hierarchies, but transitions arose in everyday life. She wanted to impose the Catholic faith, but this became local forms of Christianity. She wanted to establish Spanish as the language of power, but many other languages remained alive. She wanted to sort people by origin, but families, markets, and cities kept mixing these origins. To this day, the colonial legacy in South America is visible not only in inequality and conflict, but also in cultural diversity. Languages, festivals, music, religion, cuisine, and art bear traces of this long history. They are a reminder of violence and loss, but also of resistance, adaptation, and creative power. South America was deeply wounded by the colonial era, but not culturally wiped out. Much survived by changing. Chapter 12 therefore shows an important side of colonial history. Conquest not only gave rise to destruction, but also to a new multi-layered world. This world was unjust, but it was alive. People absorbed elements of different cultures, reinterpreted them, and turned them into their own forms of belonging. But the tensions of this society remained. Beneath the surface of festivals, markets, churches, and new identities, discontent and anger simmered. Forced labor, taxes, loss of land, racism, and political exclusion repeatedly led to uprisings. The colonial order was never fully accepted. And so the story of cultural mixing leads directly to the next chapter, Rebellions Against Spanish Rule. Chapter 13, Rebellions Against Spanish Rule. Spanish colonial rule in South America was never as stable as it might seem at first glance. From the outside, Spain seemed to have created a powerful system. Viceroys ruled in the name of the king, officials collected taxes, priests spread the Catholic faith, soldiers protected cities and trade routes, and mines supplied silver for the world empire. But beneath this surface, there was dissatisfaction, fear, anger, and resistance. Many people did not live in this order voluntarily. They were controlled, taxed, forced to work, deprived of their rights, or belittled because of their origin. That is why rebellions accompanied the colonial era from the very beginning. Resistance often did not begin with large uprisings, but in everyday life. Indigenous communities refused to pay taxes, hid crops, fled forced labor, or deceived officials about the number of their inhabitants. Enslaved people resisted their owners, slowed down work, fled, or established independent communities. Mestizos, free blacks, poor Creoles, and other groups also resisted taxes, abuse, or social exclusion. The colonial power constantly had to reckon with small forms of resistance. It was precisely this everyday resistance that showed that the Spanish order was never fully accepted. But again and again the dissatisfaction broke out openly. The reasons for this varied, but they were often related: excessive taxes, forced labor, loss of land, religious oppression, corruption, and abuse by local officials. In many regions, indigenous communities felt doubly burdened. They had to pay tributes and at the same time provide workers for mines, estates, or public projects. In addition, there were church taxes, market constraints, and pressure from Spanish or Creole landowners. If harvests were poor or officials were particularly brutal, the situation could escalate. Already after the conquest of the Inca Empire, supporters of the old order resisted. One of the most famous early uprisings was led by Manco Inca. The Spaniards had initially installed him as a dependent ruler, but he soon realized that they were not interested in a real restoration of Incan power. In 1536, he rose up against the Spaniards and besieged Cusco. For a moment, it seemed possible that the conquerors could be driven out of the center of the Andes. The fighting was fierce, and the Spaniards were in serious danger. In the end, however, they were able to hold on, partly because of their indigenous allies and their military advantages. Manco Inca later retreated to Vilcabamba, a hard-to-reach area where an independent remnant state of the Incas asserted itself. There, the memory of the old rule lived on. The Spaniards were only able to finally smash this last bastion decades later. In 1572, the last Inca ruler of Vilcabamba, Tupac Amaru, was captured and executed. For the Spaniards, this was to mean the end of Inca political rule. For many people in the Andes, however, the name Tupac Amaru remained a symbol of resistance. There was also long-lasting resistance in other regions of South America. Especially in the south, in today's Chile, the Mapuche resisted Spanish expansion for centuries. The Spaniards could not establish such comprehensive control there as in the central Andes. The Mapuche used their knowledge of the terrain, adapted militarily, and defended their independence with great perseverance. The conflict showed that Spanish power had limits. It was not possible to permanently subjugate indigenous societies everywhere. In the Amazon and other hard-to-reach regions, control was also limited. There, indigenous groups were able to evade, leave mission stations, or carry out attacks on colonial facilities. Spanish rule was particularly strong in cities, mining areas, and ancient centers of indigenous empires. In peripheral regions, it often had to work with negotiations, missions, and military expeditions without achieving complete control. Resistance there could mean simply withdrawing from the colonial order. One of the most significant rebellions of the colonial era was the uprising of Tupac Amaru II in the late 18th century. His real name was José Gabriel Condorcanqui. He was an indigenous nobleman from the Cusco region and claimed descent from the last Inca ruler, Tupac Amaru. His position was special. He did not belong to the poorest population, but was a local leader who knew the colonial world well. It was precisely for this reason that he understood how deep the exploitation in the Andes extended. The uprising began in 1780 at a time of growing tensions. The Spanish crown had introduced reforms to extract more revenue from the colonies. Taxes were raised, trade rules tightened, and control over the population strengthened. Particularly hated were forced labor, excessive taxes, and the power of local officials, who often acted brutally and corruptly. Tupac Amaru too opposed these abuses. He had a Spanish official captured and executed, who was considered a symbol of colonial oppression. This began an uprising that spread rapidly. Many indigenous people joined him, but mestizos and other disaffected groups also supported the movement. The uprising was initially directed against abuse and certain colonial institutions, but soon developed a much greater explosive force. The memory of the Inca Empire, the demand for justice, and the anger over social oppression were combined. For the Spanish elite, the uprising became a nightmare. He showed that the colonial order was not only threatened from the outside, but also carried explosive tensions within itself. Tupac Amaru too was eventually captured. The Spaniards reacted with extreme harshness. He was publicly executed in Cusco in 1781 after his family had also been brutally punished. The execution was intended to deter and destroy any hope of a revival of Incan power. But the opposite also happened in part. His name became a permanent symbol of resistance against oppression. Even after his death, fighting continued, and related movements shook other regions. At the same time, there were also major uprisings in today's Bolivia, including under the leadership of Tupac Katari. His real name was Julian Apaza. He led a massive siege of La Paz and also became a central figure in the indigenous resistance. This uprising was also brutally suppressed. But the fact that such movements were able to mobilize so many people showed how deep the colonial crisis was. Spanish rule was based on coercion, and if this coercion became too strong, it could turn into massive resistance. However, rebellions did not only arise among indigenous populations. Enslaved Africans and their descendants also fought against the colonial order. Flight was one of the most important forms of this resistance. In some regions, escapees founded their own settlements, which were difficult to access, and defended themselves against reconquest. These communities were places of freedom, but also constantly threatened. They preserved African memories, developed new traditions, and were often in contact with other oppressed groups. Their resistance was directed against a system that turned people into property. There were also protests in cities. Taxes, food prices, coercive measures, or political decisions could trigger unrest. City dwellers were not all affected equally, but they shared certain concerns. Traders, craftsmen, workers, free blacks, mestizos, and poor Spaniards could turn against the authorities if they saw their existence threatened. Such urban protests were often less clearly anti-colonial than later independence movements. They were often directed against concrete grievances, not necessarily against the Spanish king himself. Nevertheless, they undermined the authority of the colonial administration. The Spanish reaction to rebellions usually followed a pattern. At first, they tried to isolate leaders and intimidate supporters. Then came military violence, public punishments, executions, expropriations, and tightened controls. Movements that crossed social and ethnic boundaries seemed particularly dangerous. When indigenous people, mestizos, enslaved or free blacks, and poor Creoles acted together, it threatened the entire colonial order. That's why the elites often tried to play groups off against each other. Despite their importance, many rebellions were not successful in the direct sense. They were crushed, their leaders killed, their communities punished. But they had a long-term effect. They showed the weaknesses of the colonial system. They preserved memories of self-determination. They forced the authorities to think about reforms, control, and military security. Above all, however, they made it clear that the colonial order was not taken for granted. In the 18th century, tensions intensified further. The Spanish crown wanted to manage its colonies more efficiently and generate higher revenues. These reforms were intended to strengthen the empire, but placed an additional burden on many people. Taxes rose, local autonomies were restricted, and Creoles continued to feel excluded from important offices. While indigenous and poor population groups fought against exploitation, a different feeling of discontent grew among parts of the Creole elite. They wanted more political participation and less paternalism by Spain. This was associated with different forms of resistance. Not all groups wanted the same thing. Indigenous movements often fought against forced labor, land loss, and colonial oppression. Enslaved people fought for freedom. Creoles demanded more influence and later political independence. Poor city dwellers protested against prices and taxes. These interests could overlap, but they could also be against each other. This is precisely why the path to independence was complicated. Rebellions against Spanish rule were therefore not a marginal phenomenon. They were a constant companion of the colonial era. They arose where people no longer wanted to bear the burden of rule. They could be quiet and commonplace or powerful and open. They could have religious, social, economic, or political goals. What they had in common was that they questioned Spain's power. In the end, Spain was able to put down many of these uprisings. But every rebellion left its mark. Names such as Manco Inca, Tupac Amaru II, Tupac Katari, and the many unknown men and women of the resistance became part of a long history of memory. They showed that the colony consisted not only of submission, but also of struggle. These struggles did not automatically prepare for independence, but they weakened the belief in the sanctity of Spanish rule. When new ideas came out of Europe and America in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when revolutions shook the world and Spain itself fell into crisis, these ideas found a ground in South America that had long been riddled with conflict. This marks the beginning of the next chapter, the path to independence. Chapter 14, The Road to Independence. The independence of the Spanish colonies in South America did not arise from a single event. It was the result of many developments that had built up over decades. Beneath the surface of the colonial order, tensions grew that at some point could no longer be controlled. Spanish rule was still powerful, but it seemed increasingly fragile. Indigenous communities suffered from taxes and forced labor. Enslaved people fought for freedom. Poor city dwellers protested against taxes and prices, and the Creole elites felt excluded from political power. All these groups had different goals, but they lived in a system that more and more people felt was unjust. The role of the Creoles was particularly important. They were descendants of Spanish families, but were born in America. Many of them owned land, mines, trading companies, or political connections. They were educated, wealthy, and influential, but the highest offices in the administration, church, and military were often given to men who came directly from Spain. These so-called peninsulars often stood above the Creoles in the colonial hierarchy. For many Creoles, this became unbearable over time. They saw themselves as the real connoisseurs of America, as people who were born in the colonies and earned their wealth. Nevertheless, they had to watch as important decisions were made by officials sent from Europe. This dissatisfaction did not automatically mean that the Creoles wanted to become independent. For a long time, many felt themselves to be loyal subjects of the Spanish king. They wanted reforms, more say and less paternalism, but not necessarily complete separation from Spain. But over time, this thinking changed. The more the crown tried to control the colonies more closely and extract more revenue, the greater the resistance of the local elites. The Bourbon reforms of the 18th century were intended to make the Spanish Empire more efficient, but led to new burdens in America. Taxes have been raised, trade rules have been changed, administrative structures have been restructured, and more Spanish officials have been appointed. What Madrid regarded as modernization was perceived by many in the colonies as an encroachment on their interests. At the same time, new ideas spread. The Enlightenment called into question traditional notions of rule. Thinkers in Europe discussed freedom, natural rights, separation of powers, popular sovereignty, and the limits of royal power. Such ideas also reached South America, especially through books, universities, church circles, trade contacts, and educated elites. Of course, not all people could read, and these ideas did not spread to the same extent everywhere. But they attracted attention among Creoles, lawyers, priests, officers, and merchants. They offered a new language to express old discontent. The American Revolution and the French Revolution also acted as signals. The North American colonies had broken away from Great Britain and founded a new state. In France, the monarchy had been overthrown, and concepts such as freedom and equality had become political slogans. For the Spanish colonies, these events were both inspiring and unsettling. They showed that old empires could fall, but they also showed that revolution could mean violence, chaos, and social upheaval. In particular, the revolution in Haiti, in which enslaved people successfully fought against French colonial rule, frightened many Creole elites. They wanted independence or a say, but they feared a social uprising by the lower classes. This fear strongly shaped the path to independence. The Creole elites wanted to limit the power of Spain, but they did not necessarily want radical equality for all people. Many themselves benefited from land ownership, social hierarchy, and the work of indigenous or enslaved people. That's why the independence movement was contradictory. She spoke of freedom, but this freedom was often initially aimed primarily at the elites. For indigenous communities, enslaved people, and poor populations, it was not automatically clear that a new government would be better than the old one. Some supported independence, others remained skeptical, and still others even fought on the side of the Spanish crown if they expected more protection or advantages there. However, the decisive trigger did not come from South America itself, but from Europe. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain. The Spanish king Ferdinand VII was forced to abdicate, and Napoleon's brother Joseph Bonaparte was installed as king. This plunged the Spanish monarchy into a deep crisis. For the colonies, a fundamental question suddenly arose. Who should they obey when the rightful king was imprisoned and Spain was controlled by a foreign power? In many Spanish areas, so-called juntas, i.e. political bodies that claimed to act in the name of the absent king, were created. Such juntas also formed in South America. Initially, many of them did not immediately declare independence. Rather, they said they would preserve the rights of Ferdinand VII as long as Spain was occupied. But these bodies created a new political reality. For the first time, local groups ruled without direct control by Spanish officials. What began as loyalty to the king became a step towards self-government. In cities such as Caracas, Buenos Aires, Bogota, Quito, and Santiago, political upheavals occurred. Local elites, militias, lawyers, and urban groups discussed power, legitimacy, and the future. Some wanted to return to the old order as soon as the king was free again. Others wanted greater autonomy. Still others began to demand real independence. Colonial society split. Camps of royalists who remained loyal to the Spanish crown and patriots who fought for self-government or independence emerged. The path to independence thus became a civil war. It wasn't easy. Spain against America. In many regions, Americans fought against Americans. Creoles stood on both sides. Indigenous communities, free blacks, enslaved people, and mestizos made decisions based on local interests. Some supported the patriots because they hoped for freedom, land, or social advancement. Others supported the royalists because they distrusted the local elites or because Spanish authorities had guaranteed them certain rights. The fronts were more complicated than later national narratives often claimed. Charismatic leaders played a central role. In the north of South America, Simón Bolívar became the most important figure. He came from a wealthy Creole family in Venezuela and developed into a determined opponent of Spanish rule. Bolívar combined military talent with political vision. He dreamed of a free, united America, even if this dream later became only partially a reality. His campaigns led through Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. In doing so, he had to fight not only against Spanish troops, but also against regional rivalries, difficult landscapes, diseases, supply problems, and political tensions. In the south, José de San Martín became a decisive figure. He had gained military experience in Europe and became one of the most important leaders of the independence movement in southern South America. From Argentina, he organized a daring crossing of the Andes to liberate Chile. After that, he turned his attention to Peru, which was considered a strong center of royalist power. San Martín understood that the independence of individual regions was not certain as long as Spain could hold important centers of power. His strategy was therefore continental. The liberation of South America was a long and difficult process. Victories and defeats alternated. Cities were conquered, lost, and conquered again. Armies disintegrated through hunger, disease, or desertion. The population suffered violence, looting, and insecurity. The war destroyed trade routes, put a strain on agriculture, and put many families in need. For many ordinary people, independence was initially not a celebratory moment, but a time of fear and deprivation. Nevertheless, the war changed society. In some regions, enslaved people were promised freedom if they fought in patriotic armies. Indigenous and mixed populations became indispensable as soldiers. The independence armies could not exist without them. This opened up limited opportunities for social advancement, but the old inequalities did not disappear. Many promises were only partially fulfilled or restricted after the war. Gradually, Spain lost control of large parts of South America. The decisive battles in the first half of the 19th century sealed the end of Spanish rule on the continent. But independence was not a clean cut. New states emerged, but they were politically unstable. Borders were disputed, regional elites fought for power, and the question of who belonged to the nation remained open. Bolívar's dream of a great unity was soon shattered by rivalries, distances, and different interests. For many people, less changed after independence than the great freedom speeches had promised. The Spanish civil servants disappeared, but the social hierarchies remained. Creole elites often took power. Indigenous communities continued to fight for land and recognition. Slavery persisted in some countries for decades. Poor farmers, workers, and people of mixed origin were often excluded from political participation. The colonial order was politically broken, but it continued to have an impact on society. Nevertheless, independence was a historic turning point. For the first time since the conquest, Spanish kings no longer officially ruled over large parts of South America. New republics were created, new constitutions were written, new symbols were created. People began to see themselves as Venezuelans, Colombians, Peruvians, Chileans, Argentines, Bolivians, or citizens of other new states. These national identities first had to grow. They arose from wars, memories, conflicts, and hopes. So the road to independence was not an easy struggle of freedom against oppression. It was a multi-layered process in which different groups pursued different goals. For Creoles, independence meant political self-determination. For many soldiers, it meant hope for wages, land, or freedom. For enslaved people, it could be a chance for liberation. For indigenous communities, it was often ambivalent because new states did not automatically respect their rights. For Spain, it meant the loss of a large part of its empire. In the end, Spanish colonial rule collapsed because it came under pressure from within and without. The crisis of the monarchy, the ideas of the Enlightenment, economic interests, Creole discontent, social tensions, and the military determination of the independence leaders all worked together. No single factor explains everything. It was only their union that made the break possible. But the history of the colonial era did not end completely with independence. Their traces have been preserved in language, religion, property relations, social hierarchies, borders, and cultures of remembrance. The new states inherited not only land, but also problems that had arisen in the colonial era. Thus, the path to independence leads to the last chapter, the colonial legacy to this day. Chapter 15, Epilogue, the colonial legacy to the present day. With independence, Spain's direct rule over large parts of South America ended. Spanish viceroys lost their power, new republics emerged, flags were designed, constitutions were written, and national heroes were celebrated. At first glance, it seemed that a new era had begun. But history does not simply disappear just because a king is overthrown or a colonial administration is abolished. The Spanish colonial era had shaped South America for centuries. Their traces have been preserved in language, religion, society, economy, politics, and memory. Many of these traces are still visible today. One of the most obvious heirs of the Spanish colonial era is language. In most countries of South America, Spanish is still the official language and everyday language. It connects regions, states, and people across great distances. At the same time, this language is a reminder that it became the dominant language through conquest, proselytizing, and administration. Before the arrival of the Spaniards, there was an enormous linguistic diversity. Many indigenous languages were pushed back, some disappeared completely, others survived despite persecution and social pressure. Quechua, Aymara, Guarani, and numerous other indigenous languages are still spoken today. They are not only a means of communication, but also carriers of memory, worldviews, and identity. Ideas that are older than the colonial era live on in them. But many speakers had to experience discrimination for a long time. Anyone who spoke an indigenous language was often considered backward or uneducated in colonial and later also in national societies. It is only in recent times that many countries have become more aware of the importance of these languages. Nevertheless, the struggle for linguistic equality remains part of the colonial legacy. Religion also bears deep traces of the colonial era. Catholicism was introduced by the Spaniards with force. Churches, monasteries, the veneration of saints, processions, and Christian holidays characterize many South American societies to this day. But the faith that arose there is not simply a copy of Spanish Catholicism. For centuries, it has been associated with indigenous and African traditions. In many festivals, pilgrimages, and religious practices, older ideas of nature, ancestors, protective powers, and community live on. The colonial goal was religious unification, but the result was often cultural mixing. This mixing is one of the most important features of South America. Cuisine, music, art, clothing, festivals, and everyday culture carry influences from Europe, America, and Africa. Potatoes, corn, beans, cocoa, and chili combined with European and African ingredients and cooking methods. Spanish instruments met African rhythms and indigenous melodies. Ecclesiastical art was shaped by local artists who brought their own colors, symbols, and landscapes. The result was a cultural diversity that exists not despite, but because of, the contradictory history of the colonial era. But the colonial legacy does not only consist of cultural diversity. It also consists of inequality. The Spanish colonial society divided people according to origin, skin color, place of birth, and legal status. Spaniards and their descendants stood at the top. Indigenous people and enslaved Africans were exploited and devalued. This order did not disappear completely after independence. Legal categories were changed, and the new republics spoke of citizens and nations. But property, education, and political power often remained in the hands of small elites. Many of these elites were of Creole origin. They had fought against Spanish domination or benefited from independence, but often adopted the political and economic structures of the colonial era. Indigenous communities, people of African descent, poor farmers, and workers were rarely included on an equal footing in the new states. In some cases, indigenous communities even lost further protection after independence because communal land rights were attacked and privatized. Freedom, then, did not mean the same thing to everyone. The colonial legacy is particularly evident in the land question. During the colonial period, Spanish settlers, churches, religious orders, and later large landowners had controlled huge areas. Many indigenous communities have been displaced or confined to smaller areas. After independence, land ownership remained extremely unevenly distributed. Large estates often faced few families, while many people owned little or no land. This inequality led to social conflicts, peasant movements, and demands for land reforms, which still preoccupy many countries in South America today. The economies of many South American countries were also shaped by colonial structures. The colonies were designed to supply raw materials, silver, gold, agricultural products, and later other export goods. The needs of the local population often took a back seat to the interests of the world market. This pattern continued in a different form after independence. Many countries remained dependent on exports of fewer raw materials, while industry, infrastructure, and social development were unevenly distributed. The colonial orientation towards exploitation and export thus had a long-lasting effect. The political borders of South America also bear colonial traces. Many of today's states arose from former administrative offices, viceroyalty, audiencias, or military spheres of power. These borders did not always correspond to the habitats of indigenous peoples, trade relations, or cultural contexts. After independence, border issues repeatedly led to conflicts. New nations had to be created from colonial spaces, which were often very different. Subjects of the Spanish crown were to become citizens of new states. This process was difficult and has not yet been completed on some issues. Another legacy lies in the memory itself. For a long time, colonial history was told primarily from the point of view of the conquerors and the independence heroes. Conquistadors were seen as courageous adventurers, missionaries as bringers of faith, and independence leaders as liberators. The perspectives of indigenous people, enslaved Africans, women, workers, and poor population groups were often in the background. But in recent decades, the view has changed. More and more people are asking, who suffered under colonial rule? Who resisted? Which voices were silenced? These questions are not just academic. They concern monuments, street names, school textbooks, national holidays, and political debates. In many countries today, there is a dispute about how to deal with the legacy of the colonial era. Should statues of conquerors be left standing? Should they be explained, moved, or removed? How do you remember violence without simplifying history? How do you honor indigenous and African contributions that have long been devalued? Remembrance itself has become a place of conflict. Indigenous movements play an important role in this. In many countries in South America, indigenous peoples are fighting for land rights, political recognition, protection of their languages, cultural self-determination, and respect for their history. They point out that colonialism is not just a closed chapter of the past. Its consequences are evident in poverty, discrimination, environmental destruction, and a lack of political participation. When indigenous communities protest against mining projects, deforestation, or displacement today, they often tie in with a long history of resistance. People of African descent are also demanding greater recognition of their history. The role of slavery in South America has long been underestimated or suppressed. But Afro-South American communities have deeply influenced the culture, music, religion, language, cuisine, and politics of many countries. At the same time, they continue to suffer from social disadvantage and racism in many regions. Here, too, the colonial order continues to have an effect, even if its legal forms have disappeared. The colonial heritage is also evident in the relationship with nature. The Spanish colonial economy viewed land, forests, mountains, and rivers primarily as resources that could be used and exploited. Mining in particular permanently changed landscapes. This logic continued in many later economic models. Raw material extraction, plantation management, deforestation, and large-scale projects are still often in conflict with the rights of local communities and the protection of the environment. The question of who owns land and nature is therefore also a question of colonial continuity. At the same time, it would be wrong to describe South America only in terms of injury and loss. The people of the continent did not simply passively inherit the colonial past. They have reinterpreted it, fought it, remembered it, and transformed it into new forms. Living cultures emerged from coercion and mixing. Oppression gave rise to resistance. Colonial cities became modern metropolises. Old languages became symbols of political self-assertion. Religious hybrids have become identities that connect millions of people. The history of the Spanish colonies in South America is therefore not a finished episode that exists only in museums or history books. It lives on in street names, family histories, festivals, social inequalities, political movements, languages, and landscapes. If you want to understand South America today, you have to know this history. Not to explain the present entirely from the past, but to recognize why certain questions are still so important today. Who owns land? Who will be heard? Which languages are considered valuable? What story is being told? And what wounds are still open? At the end of this journey through the Spanish colonial period, a contradictory picture remains. Spain did not simply bring civilization, as earlier colonial narratives claimed. The Spaniards encountered rich, complex, and diverse societies. They destroyed empires, plundered treasures, forced people to work, and tried to enforce their religion and order. At the same time, a new world emerged from this violent encounter, characterized by mixing, adaptation, and resistance. The history of South America is therefore not only the history of the conquerors. It is the story of the Incas and other indigenous peoples, the enslaved Africans and their descendants, the mestizos, the Creoles, the women in markets and households, the miners of Potosi, the missionaries, the rebels, the peasants, the soldiers, and the millions of people whose names are not in the great chronicles. They have all left their mark on this history. When we look back at the Spanish colonies in South America today, we should not only ask what conquered Spain, we should also ask what the people of South America have preserved. Despite violence, illness, forced labor, and cultural oppression, their voices did not disappear. They live on in languages, songs, rituals, memories, and struggles for justice. The story doesn't really end there. It extends to the present day. The colonial past is not a distant shadow, but a foundation on which many of today's societies have been built, with all its contradictions, beauties, and injustices. Those who understand this past no longer see South America as just a continent of conquest, but as a continent of survival, diversity, and resistance.